Hey there and welcome back. If the day is finally behind you, and the room has gone quiet, and there is nothing left that needs doing tonight, then let me take you somewhere far away and long ago into the life of a woman you may feel you half know already, though you have almost certainly never met her. Tonight we are going to Imperial Vienna, into the 18th century, the age of powdered wigs and baroque palaces and candlelit ballrooms, to follow the whole long life of a woman who was handed an empire that the law of Europe said no woman was ever meant to hold, and who held it anyway for 40 years, against kings and armies and the settled opinion of the age. Her name was Maria Theresa, and if it is less familiar to you than it ought to be, you will know her daughter, for the youngest girl she raised and worried over, and at last sent away across the Alps, was Marie Antoinette. This is an evening for anyone who has wondered what kind of mother makes a queen like that, and what kind of person holds an empire together with her own two hands. So let yourself settle, and let the present slip away, and come back with me 300 years to a palace by the Danube, where a child is about to be born who was never supposed to rule and would end by ruling almost everything. And here is the thread I want you to keep hold of as we go. This is someone who would lose, in a single week, her father, her inheritance, and half the friends who had sworn to protect her, and would have to decide, at 23 years old and heavily with child, whether to surrender or to fight. We will reach that week in time, but first we must go back to the very beginning, to the morning she came into the world, and to the quiet disappointment that greeted her. Before we step into that world, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what hour it has reached where you are. Whether it is deep night or the soft edge of the evening, whether the air around you is warm or the cold is leaning against the window, it is good to have your company on a journey as long as this one. If you would like to leave a word in the comments, telling me which corner of the world you are in and the time upon your clock, I do enjoy looking through them, and there's a quiet pleasure in picturing so many of us gathered here from so many different places, drawn to the same old story on the same still night. And if these long evenings in vanished centuries are something you would like to return to, you are always welcome to subscribe, so that the next of them will be waiting whenever you want it. There is no hurry in any of it. The palace we are about to enter has stood for 300 years, and it will keep a little longer. Picture this. It is the 13th of May in 1717, and the Hofburg Palace in the heart of Vienna is awake before dawn, its windows lit, its corridors full of soft, urgent movement, for the Empress is in labour and the whole court is waiting. Outside, the city of the Habsburgs spreads in the early light, the spires and the baroque domes, the Danube sliding past beyond the walls. Inside, in a warm shuttered chamber, a child is being born to the most powerful family in the German-speaking world, the Imperial House of Austria, which had worn the crown of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries and ruled lands scattered from the Netherlands to the edge of the Ottoman world. The father waiting for news is Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, a grave and stately and rather melancholy man, and he is waiting, as he has waited before, for one thing above all others, a son. For an emperor must have an heir, and an heir by every law and custom of the age must be a boy. And the child, when she comes, is a girl. They name her Maria Theresa, and she is healthy and strong, and she will live, which is itself no small thing in an age that buried children as a matter of course. But she is a girl, and the disappointment in the rooms of the Hofburg is real, however carefully it is hidden behind the ceremony and the cannon fire and the formal rejoicing. For Charles had already lost the one thing he most wanted. A son had been born to him the year before, a little archduke named Leopold, the boy who was to inherit everything, and that child had died in infancy, and no other son would come. There would be more daughters after Maria Theresa, but never the boy. And so this strong, healthy girl, born into quiet disappointment on a spring morning in Vienna, was, though almost no one wished to say it aloud, the nearest he had to an heir that the emperor was ever going to have. This was a problem of the first magnitude, and it shaped everything. For the Habsburg lands did not pass to women. By the deep custom of the empire and the expectation of all Europe, a great inheritance went to a man, and a woman might at most carry a claim to a husband or a son, but could not sit at the head of it herself. An emperor with only daughters was an emperor facing a crisis, but when he died his scattered realms might be claimed and quarrelled over and torn apart by every neighbouring prince who fancied a peace, and the great house of Austria might simply come undone. Charles knew this better than anyone, and he spent much of his reign, much of his daughter's childhood, labouring to prevent it, to find some way to make the unthinkable lawful, to secure for this girl the inheritance that custom would deny her. His answer was a document, a great legal instrument that he laboured over and pressed upon the courts of Europe year after year, called the Pragmatic Sanction. In plain terms, it was a law declaring that the Habsburg lands should pass undivided to his heir, even if that heir were female, and binding his own subjects, and, he hoped, the other powers of Europe to accept it. He spent the strength of his reign on it. He bargained, and bribed, and conceded, and signed away advantages to one court after another, in exchange for their solemn promise to honour the sanction, and recognise his daughter's right when the time came. By the end, on paper, nearly all of the continent had agreed. The kings and electors had set their hands and seals to it. Maria Theresa's inheritance seemed secured by the signed word of every power that mattered, and it would prove, when the testing day arrived, to be worth almost nothing at all, for a promise made to a living emperor is one thing, and a promise kept to a young woman with no army at her back is quite another. But that reckoning lay far ahead, for now there was only a small girl growing up in the greatest court in Central Europe, watched over and adored and entirely unaware that her whole life was already the subject of treaties, and it is into her childhood that we turn next. Come closer, then, into the world of the little Archduchess, for it was a gilded and a sheltered one, and it tells us a good deal about how unready she was for what lay ahead. She grew up in the heart of the Habsburg court, between the rambling Hofburg in the city and the summer palaces in the green country outside it, surrounded by the immense formality of the most ceremonious court in Europe, where every hour of the day had its appointed ritual and every person their appointed place. She was an Archduchess of Austria, the eldest daughter of the emperor, and she was treated with the deep reverence due to her blood. And yet, for all that, she was raised far more as a pious and accomplished princess than as the heir to an empire, because her father, who had moved heaven and earth to secure her inheritance on paper, never quite brought himself to prepare her to govern it, in fact. This is one of the strange and telling failures at the root of her story. Charles spent his whole reign making Maria Theresa his heir, and almost no effort at all making her a ruler. She was not taught statecraft, nor finance, nor the management of armies, nor the hard machinery of government that she would one day have to seize and master under the worst possible conditions. She was not brought into the councils of state, or not schooled in the dispatches and the diplomacy and the grinding daily work of holding a great realm together. Perhaps her father could not bring himself to believe she would really have to do it alone. Perhaps he trusted that a husband would be found to carry the burden for her. Perhaps, like many men of his age, he simply could not imagine a woman at the true centre of power. Whatever the reason, the girl who would have to fight for her throne against half of Europe was given an education that fitted her for the drawing room and the chapel, and barely at all for the council chamber. What she was given was the education of a Catholic princess, and it was thorough in its own way. She was raised by the Jesuits and the devout women of her mother's circle in a piety that was deep and sincere, and would never leave her. Faith was the bedrock of her whole nature, the fixed centre from which she saw the world, and it was laid down in these early years. She was taught languages, for the Habsburg lands were a patchwork of tongues, and a ruler needed several. She learned her French and her Italian, her Latin for the church, the German of Vienna, and something of the other peoples she would rule. She was taught to draw and to paint a little, to carry herself, to dance. And above all, she was taught and given music, for she had a real and lifelong love of it, and a fine singing voice, and the Vienna of her childhood was already on its way to becoming the musical capital of the world. She sang in court entertainments as a girl, performed in the little operas got up for family occasions, and kept her delight in music to the end of her days. She was, by every account, a bright, warm, high-spirited child, quick and strong-willed and full of life, with a directness and a vigour that the stiff formality of the court could not quite contain. She was not bookish in the scholarly way. She was practical, shrewd, intensely human, governed more by a sound instinct and an iron sense of duty than by abstract learning, and she was loved, and she loved in return, with the whole-hearted warmth that marked her all her life. There was nothing cold or calculating in the girl, and nothing of it in the woman either. Whatever else she became, she remained someone of large and open feeling, who wept easily and laughed easily, and held the people she cared for fiercely close. And there was one person she came to care for above all others very early, with a constancy that is rare anywhere and almost unheard of among the dynastic marriages of kings. His name was Francis Stephen, the young Duke of Lorraine, and he had come to the Viennese court as a boy to be brought up under the emperor's eye, as was sometimes done with promising princes. He was some years older than Maria Theresa, handsome and easy and charming, and she seems to have lost her heart to him when she was still a girl of 6 or 7, and he a youth about the court, and never to have wavered afterward. For year upon year she wanted him, and no one else, and made it quietly and stubbornly plain that she wanted him, in a world where princesses did not choose their husbands, and were not expected to want anything at all in the matter beyond what policy decided. It was in its way the first great act of her famous will. She had fixed her heart, and once Maria Theresa's heart was fixed, it did not move. So the picture of her childhood is of a girl raised in splendour and affection and piety, secure in the love of her family and the reverence of a vast court, gifted and warm and strong-willed, with a settled devotion to her faith, and a settled longing for one particular young man, and almost no preparation whatsoever for the colossal task that was quietly being readied for her in the treaties her father signed. She believed, as everyone around her believed, that her inheritance was safe, sealed by the solemn word of all Europe. She had no notion of how thin that paper safety would prove, nor of how soon, nor of how much she would have to learn, alone and under fire, in the hardest school there is. For the moment she was simply a happy young woman waiting, with a stubborn patience, to be allowed to marry the man she loved, and that, against all the odds of royal life, is exactly what she was about to be permitted to do. The marriage she wanted was not a simple thing to arrange, for even a love match between an archduchess and a duke was at this level an affair of state tangled up in the vast chessboard of European power. Francis Stephen was the heir to the Duchy of Lorraine, that small but ancient territory wedged between France and the German lands, and his marriage to the heiress of the Habsburg Empire was a matter that the other powers, and France above all, watched with a jealous eye. For Lorraine sat on France's border, and the French could not abide the thought of that strategic little duchy being joined, through Francis, to the vast power of Austria. A Habsburg Lorraine on her frontier was intolerable to the French crown, and France was strong enough to make the objection felt. And so the marriage Maria Theresa had set her heart upon could only be bought at a price, and the price was Lorraine itself. The arrangement that was eventually struck was a hard one for the young Duke. To clear the way for the marriage and to satisfy the French, Francis Stephen was required to give up his ancestral duchy, the land of his fathers, the patrimony of his house, and to accept in exchange the distant Grand Duchy of Tuscany in Italy, which would fall vacant in due course. It was a heavy thing to ask of a man, to surrender the country of his ancestors for a territory he had never seen, and he hesitated, and felt the loss of it keenly, and signed at last with a reluctance that is wholly understandable. There is a story that he murmured as he gave up his inheritance, words to the effect that there was no Lorraine without a Lorraine to hold it. But sign he did, for the prize on the other side of the bargain was Maria Theresa, and through her one day the inheritance of the Habsburgs, and so the Duke gave up his duchy, and the path to the marriage was clear. They were married in February of the year 1736, in Vienna, with all the splendour the imperial court could command, and Maria Theresa, who had wanted this man since she was a child, was radiantly, wholeheartedly happy. This is the thing that sets her marriage apart from almost every other dynastic union of the age, and that anyone who knows the loveless royal matches of the period will feel at once. She loved her husband, genuinely and passionately and for the whole of his life, and she had married the one man on earth she wanted. In a world where princesses were bartered to strangers across distant borders, and learned, if they were lucky, a kind of dutiful tolerance for the men chosen for them, Maria Theresa had held out for love, and, by a rare turn of fortune and the sheer force of her own will, had won it. The young couple were devoted to each other from the first. It is worth being clear-eyed about the marriage, because the love in it was real, but it was not, on both sides, of quite the same temperature. Maria Theresa adored Francis with an intensity that never cooled across nearly 30 years. She wanted him near her, fretted when he was away, delighted in his company, and gave herself to him body and soul. Francis loved her too, in his easier and more wandering way, but he was a charming, pleasure-loving, somewhat indolent man, fond of his amusements and not always faithful, and the difference between them was that she would become the towering ruler and he would remain, for all his titles, essentially her consort. He was no statesman, his gifts lay elsewhere in finance and in pleasure and in the agreeable arts of living, the iron, the genius for rule, the colossal capacity for work. All of that was hers. But none of it dimmed her love for him. She forgave him much, held him close, bore him child after child, and mourned him, when the day came, as few wives have ever mourned a husband. For the moment, though, in the first years of the marriage, none of the storms had broken, and the young couple lived in a happiness that must have seemed, looking back from later sorrows, almost like a separate and golden age. Maria Theresa was a wife, and soon a mother, settling into the life of the court, beginning the vast family that would in time number 16 children. Vienna glittered around them, the music and the masks and the endless ceremony of the most baroque court in Europe. The emperor, her father, still lived and ruled. The great inheritance was still safely his, and the questions of how she would hold it were still, mercifully, in the future. She was a young married woman in love, having babies and singing in court entertainments and enjoying the splendour of her station, with no real power yet and no real burden, and no reason to suppose that the comfortable order of things would change. But it was about to change, utterly and without warning, and the change would fall on her with the suddenness of a thunderclap. For her father, the emperor, who had spent his life securing her inheritance on paper, was nearing the end of his, and when he went, all the careful treaties and all the solemn promises of Europe would be put to the test at once. The happy young wife, with her adored husband and her growing nursery and her singing voice, was about to be handed, with almost no warning and almost no preparation, the whole weight of the Habsburg world, at the very moment when half the princes of Europe decided to tear it from her hands. The golden days were ending. The testing was about to begin. Let us linger a little in those last quiet years before the storm, the season of the young wife, because the world she lived in then was not at all what it appeared to be, and the gap between the appearance and the truth is the key to everything that followed. To look at the court of Vienna in the 1730s was to see one of the most magnificent spectacles in Europe, the immense baroque palaces, the gilded staterooms, the ceaseless ceremony, the music and the masks, the proud name of Habsburg that had bestridden Christendom for centuries and worn the imperial crown almost without a break for 3 centuries. The Emperor Charles ruled then, in his stately melancholy way, over a sprawl of lands and peoples that stretched across the heart of the continent, and from the outside the whole edifice looked as solid and as permanent as the mountains. Maria Theresa, the young wife at the centre of it, glittered along with the rest, the adored daughter of the emperor, married to the man she loved, beginning her family, singing in the court entertainments, living the bright, untroubled life of an imperial princess at the height of her happiness. But beneath the gilding, the whole structure was hollow and rotten in places, and dangerously weak. The long reign of her father had been, for all its outward dignity, a slow draining away of Habsburg strength. There had been costly wars against the Ottoman Turks in the east and the Bourbon powers in the west, and they had gone, on the whole, badly, swallowing money and men and territory and leaving little to show for it. The treasury was all but empty, drained dry by decades of expensive failure. The army, the indispensable instrument of any power, had been let run down until it was a shadow of what it needed to be, under strength, underpaid, badly led, in no condition to defend the vast frontiers it was supposed to guard. The administration was a tangle of overlapping authorities and jealous local estates, each of the many Habsburg lands clinging to its own privileges and its own institutions, so that the realm was less a single state than a loose bundle of provinces held together by the person of the ruler and little else. And the rot was not in the past alone. It was fresh and bleeding. In the very last years of her father's reign, Austria had blundered into a war against the Ottoman Turks on the eastern frontier, and it had gone humiliatingly wrong, the imperial armies mismanaged and beaten, the campaigns ending in a peace that surrendered hard-won territory, including the fortress city of Belgrade, back to the Turks. It was a recent and a stinging disgrace, fresh in every mind, and it laid bare to all of Europe exactly how weak the once mighty House of Austria had become, how poorly led its armies, how shaky its finances, how vulnerable its sprawling frontiers. The predators who would soon gather around the young queen had watched that war and drawn their conclusions. They knew, before ever she came to the throne, that the Habsburg lion had lost its teeth. And the inheritance itself, that magnificent sprawl of territories, was as much a weakness as a strength, for it was scattered and indefensible and coveted on every side. The Habsburg lands were not a compact kingdom, but a far-flung patchwork. The Austrian heartlands around Vienna, the kingdom of Bohemia with its rich city of Prague, the kingdom of Hungary stretching away to the east, the duchy of Milan in Italy, the distant Austrian Netherlands far to the northwest, and more besides, a collection of crowns and duchies and counties speaking a dozen languages and bound by no common law. To hold such an inheritance together took strength and money and an army and a sure hand, and Charles was leaving his daughter with very little of any of them. He had secured her right to the lands on paper. He had not left her the means to defend them. Into this deceptive splendour Maria Theresa was bringing children, for the great work of her marriage in these years, as the world saw it, was the bearing of heirs. The babies came quickly, as they would go on coming for the next 2 decades, daughters first, one after another, healthy and welcomed, and dynastically not quite enough, for the old anxiety about a male heir hung over her marriage as it had hung over her parents. She was a devoted mother from the first, hands-on and anxious and warm, and she carried and bore her children with a robust constitution that would see her through 16 pregnancies, a thing that itself speaks to the strength in her. But in these early years, she was a mother and a wife and an archduchess, not a ruler. She had no share in government, no seat in her father's councils, no training in the management of the weak and tangled inheritance she was one day to receive. She lived in the bright outer world of the court, while the hard inner machinery of the state turned without her, in rooms she was never shown. It is one of the cruelties of her story, and one of the marvels of it, that she came to power knowing almost nothing of how power worked, and had to learn it all at a run, under fire, with everything already collapsing around her. A wiser father might have spent those quiet seasons teaching her, bringing her into the councils, showing her the dispatches, letting her watch the slow craft of holding a realm together. Charles did not. Whether from the assumptions of his age, or a reluctance to face his own mortality, or a simple failure of imagination, he left his clever, strong, capable daughter in the dark about the very thing she would have to master. And so the young wife glittered on through the last years of the old reign, happy and unprepared, while the treasury emptied, and the army withered, and the vultures of Europe watched and waited, sharpening behind their courtly smiles and their signed and sealed promises the claims they meant to press the moment the old emperor was gone. For he was failing. Charles VI, who had given his reign to securing his daughter's inheritance and almost nothing to preparing her for it, fell ill in the autumn of 1740 after a chill caught out hunting, so the story runs, and a meal of mushrooms that disagreed with him. It does not greatly matter what the immediate cause was. What matters is that within a few days the emperor was dead, and the whole vast precarious inheritance, with its empty treasury and its broken army and its scattered indefensible lands and its mountain of solemn worthless promises, passed in an instant to a woman of 23 years old, heavily pregnant, in love with her husband, and almost entirely untrained for the task of holding any of it. The old order had ended between one breath and the next, and before Maria Theresa had even finished mourning her father, the storm that he had spent his life trying to prevent broke over her head with a speed and a savagery that took the breath away. She came to her inheritance in the last days of October, in 1740, a young woman in mourning for her father, and carrying a child in her body, suddenly the sovereign of a great and threatened realm. Her titles came in a long and sonorous list: Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, and a dozen more besides. The one crown she could not have was the imperial one itself, for a woman could not be elected Holy Roman Emperor, and that dignity would have to be sought, in time, for her husband. But the lands, the hereditary Habsburg lands that her father had laboured to secure for her, were hers, and she took them up with a composure that surprised those around her, for whatever she lacked in training, she did not lack in nerve. From almost the first day, those who expected a frightened girl to lean helplessly on her ministers found instead a young queen with a will of iron, and a clear sense that the inheritance was hers, and that she meant to keep it. She would need every scrap of that nerve, and sooner than anyone imagined. For the solemn promises of Europe, the signed and sealed recognitions of the Pragmatic Sanction that her father had spent his reign collecting, began to dissolve almost the moment he was in his grave. The vultures had been waiting, and they did not wait long. All across the continent, Princes who had pledged their honour to respect Maria Theresa's inheritance now looked at the young woman on the throne, at the empty treasury and the broken army behind her, and saw not an obligation to be honoured, but an opportunity to be seized. The Elector of Bavaria advanced old claims to the Habsburg lands and made ready to press them. France, the ancient enemy of the House of Austria, prepared to fish in the troubled waters and dismember her dominions for good. Others gathered, scenting weakness, ready to take their share. The carefully built paper wall of the Pragmatic Sanction proved, in the testing, to be made of nothing at all. But the first and the sharpest blow came from a quarter that mattered most, and from a man who would be the great adversary of her whole life. Far to the north, in the kingdom of Prussia, a new king had just come to his own throne, a young man of cold brilliance and ruthless ambition named Frederick, who would in time be called Frederick the Great. Prussia was a rising power, compact and disciplined, and armed with one of the finest small armies in Europe, drilled to a hard edge by Frederick's father, and the new king meant to make his mark and enlarge his kingdom, and he saw in the accession of a young and unready woman the perfect moment to strike. He cast his eye upon Silesia, a rich and populous Habsburg province on his border, a land of textile towns and good farmland and real wealth, and he resolved to take it, treaty or no treaty, right or no right. In the depth of that first winter, scarcely weeks after the old emperor's death, without warning and without any just cause that could bear examination, Frederick marched his army into Silesia and seized it. It was naked aggression, the cool theft of a province from a young woman who had done nothing to provoke it, justified by claims so threadbare that Frederick himself in private made little pretense that they were anything but a pretext. And it was the spark that lit the whole conflagration. Frederick's seizure of Silesia showed every other predator in Europe that the Habsburg inheritance could be torn at with impunity, that the new queen was fair game, that the promises sworn to her father need not be kept, and one after another the other powers moved in to take their share, until Maria Theresa found herself, within months of her accession, facing a coalition of enemies bent on carving up her lands among themselves, and reducing the great House of Austria to a wreck. The war that followed, the long struggle to defend her inheritance against half of Europe, would come to be called the War of the Austrian Succession, and it would consume the first 8 years of her reign. Her position in that first dreadful winter was as bad as it could be. Her treasury was empty, her army weak and scattered and unready, her ministers cautious and demoralized, her allies few and faithless. The hard heads around her counselled compromise, urged her to come to terms, to buy off Frederick by ceding him a slice of Silesia, and so perhaps detach him from the gathering enemies before the whole structure collapsed. It was the prudent advice, the advice of men who could count armies and money and saw no way to win. And Maria Theresa, 23 years old, newly bereaved, heavily pregnant, with disaster pressing in on every side, refused it. She would not buy peace by surrendering her people and her lands. She would not begin her reign by giving away what her ancestors had held. She would fight. It was the same iron that had made her hold out for the husband she wanted, turned now to the defence of an empire, and it astonished the men around her, who had expected to manage a pliable girl, and found instead a sovereign who would not bend. But will alone does not win wars, and will alone could not save her in that first terrible year, for she had almost nothing to fight with. She needed an army and money to pay it, and above all she needed loyal subjects willing to rise and bleed for her when the trained soldiers and the full treasuries of her enemies were closing in. And it was here, at the lowest point of her fortunes, with Silesia lost and the enemies multiplying and her own capital under threat, that Maria Theresa made the boldest and most brilliant gamble of her early reign. She turned not to her cautious German ministers, but to the proudest and most troublesome of all her many peoples, the one her family had quarrelled with for generations, and threw herself and her infant son upon their mercy and their loyalty. She went to the Hungarians. The Hungarians were a difficult and a vital people, and to understand the boldness of what she did, you have to understand the relationship. Hungary was one of the greatest of the Habsburg crowns, a vast and proud kingdom, with a fierce, independent-minded nobility that had never been easy to govern, that guarded its ancient liberties jealously, and that had more than once risen in arms against the rule of Vienna. The Hungarian lords were warriors with a long tradition of fighting on horseback, and their loyalty, when it was given, was worth a good deal, for they could put real fighting men into the field. But it had often been withheld, and the relationship between the proud kingdom and its Habsburg sovereigns had been prickly and resentful for generations. To stake everything on Hungarian loyalty, at the moment of greatest weakness, was a gamble of the highest order. And Maria Theresa staked everything on it. In the autumn of the year 1741, with her enemies closing in and her cause near desperate, she went to Pressburg, the Hungarian coronation city on the Danube, to be crowned Queen of Hungary, and to ask the assembled nobility of the kingdom, in person, to come to her aid. She had already been crowned there with the ancient crown of St. Stephen, riding up the coronation hill on horseback and slashing her sword to the 4 points of the compass in the old warrior ceremony of the Hungarian kings, a young woman performing the rites of a soldier king before a watching nation. Now she came before the Diet, the assembly of the Hungarian magnates, to make her appeal, and she made it with a sure instinct for the hearts of the men she was addressing. She came before them not as a distant German overlord demanding obedience, but as a wronged and courageous young queen throwing herself upon their honour. She addressed them in Latin, the language of the Hungarian nobility, and she spoke of her desperate situation with a frankness and a dignity that cut straight through the old resentments. Abandoned by her friends, beset by her enemies, she told them she placed herself and her children and her crown in the hands of the Hungarian nation, and trusted to their ancient loyalty and their famous valour. And there is a moment, half history and half legend, that has come down through the centuries as the image of that day, the young queen standing before the assembled lords, and by the story long told, the infant heir held in her arms or near her, the appeal to their chivalry made flesh in the sight of the child. Whether the baby was truly in her arms at the crucial moment the chroniclers dispute, but the emotional truth of the scene is real enough. A mother and a queen, stripped of everything but her courage, asking a proud warrior people to stand for her. And they answered. The Hungarian magnates, moved by the spectacle and the appeal and the chance to bind the crown to them by an act of loyalty, rose and drew their swords and pledged themselves to her cause with the cry that has rung down the centuries, their life and their blood for their queen. It was the turning point of her early reign. The pledge of the Hungarians gave her what she most desperately needed, the promise of armies, of fighting men, of a warlike kingdom thrown into the scale on her side at the very moment when everything seemed lost. The cautious calculation of her German ministers had offered her only surrender. The bold appeal to the proud heart of Hungary had given her an army and a future. It was a vindication of her instinct, her nerve, her sure sense of how to reach the people she ruled, and it saved her. We should be careful, as the old chroniclers were not always careful, not to turn the moment into pure romance. The Hungarian nobles did not give their loyalty for love alone. They bargained, as nobles always bargained, for confirmations of their liberties and privileges, and Maria Theresa, who was nothing if not shrewd, gave them enough to bind them without giving away the substance of her authority. It was a transaction as well as a drama, a meeting of her desperate need and their hard interest dressed in the splendid language of chivalry. But the drama was real too, and so was the result. Out of the wreckage of her first year, out of the lost province and the broken promises and the gathering enemies, Maria Theresa had pulled the one thing that could keep her in the fight, the committed loyalty of a great kingdom, and she had pulled it by her own courage and her own judgment when her ministers had counselled despair. It was the making of her as a ruler. The young woman who had come to the throne untrained and untested, who had been expected to be a pliable instrument in the hands of older and wiser men, had in the space of a single dreadful year refused to surrender her inheritance, defied the advice of her council, staked everything on a bold appeal to a difficult people, and won. She was learning at terrible speed, and under the worst conditions imaginable, the hard craft of rule, and she was discovering in herself a capacity for it that no one, least of all her late father, had suspected. The war was far from over. The worst of the fighting and the grief of permanent loss still lay ahead. But Maria Theresa had survived her first test, and survived it by becoming, almost overnight, the kind of sovereign who could hold an empire. The frightened girl her enemies had counted on conquering did not exist. In her place stood a queen. The war that the Hungarians had pledged to help her fight was a long, sprawling, exhausting affair, and had tested her to the very limit across 8 grinding years. It was not a single clean struggle, but a tangle of campaigns and shifting alliances spread across the continent. For once Frederick had shown the way into Silesia, the other powers had piled in to take their share, and Maria Theresa found herself fighting on several fronts at once against a coalition that at its worst seemed bent on dismembering her inheritance entirely. The Elector of Bavaria, Charles Albert, pressed his claims and was carried by French arms into the very Habsburg heartland. For a time enemy troops poured into Bohemia and Upper Austria, and Vienna itself, her own capital, lay under the shadow of invasion. There were dark months in those early years when it seemed entirely possible that the House of Austria would be broken up among its enemies, and the young queen left with a fragment, or with nothing. And then came a blow to her family's pride that cut almost as deep as the loss of territory. In the year 1742, the Elector of Bavaria, her enemy, was elected Holy Roman Emperor, taking the title of Charles VII. For the first time in 3 centuries, the imperial crown that the Habsburgs had worn almost as of right passed out of their house and onto the head of a rival, and Maria Theresa had to endure the spectacle of her enemy, wearing the dignity that had been her family's for centuries. It was a humiliation calculated to wound, and it wounded. But she was learning that humiliations could be survived and even reversed, and she set herself to the long work of turning the war around with a patience and a determination that slowly began to tell. For the tide did turn. Her generals found their feet. Her Hungarian and Austrian armies, ill-supplied and outmatched at first, learned to fight. Her enemies fell out among themselves, as coalitions always do, each pursuing its own interest at the expense of the common cause. Bavaria's triumph proved hollow and brief. For Charles VII, the rival emperor, was driven from his own lands almost as soon as he had been crowned, a sovereign without a capital, and when he died in 1745, his cause died with him. Maria Theresa's forces clawed back the lost ground in the heartlands, drove the invaders out of Bohemia, secured the core of the inheritance. The empire that had seemed about to dissolve held together, battered but intact, around the iron will of the woman at its centre. By the time the long war was brought to an end, by the general peace concluded at Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, Maria Theresa had achieved the thing that had seemed impossible in that first dreadful winter. She had kept her inheritance. She had kept almost all of it, The scattered Habsburg lands, the kingdoms and duchies and provinces that her enemies had meant to carve up among themselves, remained hers, undivided. The great House of Austria preserved against a continent of predators by the courage and tenacity of its young queen. It was a remarkable achievement and a personal triumph. She had come to the throne untrained and surrounded by enemies and counselled to surrender, and she had held her ground and her lands through 8 years of war and emerged with her inheritance largely whole. Few would have believed it possible in the winter of her accession. But she had not kept everything, and the one great loss was the one that would never stop hurting. Silesia, the rich province that Frederick of Prussia had snatched in that first cold December, stayed in Prussian hands. The peace confirmed it. Frederick kept his stolen prize, and Maria Theresa was forced, with whatever grace she could manage, to acknowledge the loss of one of the most valuable territories in her whole realm, a populous and prosperous land, to the man who had taken it from her by naked force. She never accepted it in her heart. The loss of Silesia became the great grievance of her reign, a wound that would not close, a theft she was determined, sooner or later, to avenge and to reverse. Her hatred of Frederick, the cold aggressor who had begun the whole catastrophe and profited most from it, became one of the fixed stars of her policy, and the recovery of Silesia became an aim she would pursue, in time, into a second and even greater war. So the first long act of her reign closed in a kind of grim and partial victory, a triumph shadowed by a loss. She had saved her empire and proved herself a ruler, but she had been robbed of a province and taught a hard lesson about the worth of treaties and the ruthlessness of the world she had to live in. And out of that hard schooling came a resolve that would shape the rest of her life. She had survived by courage and improvisation, by throwing herself on the loyalty of her peoples and the patience of her generals, but she understood now, as she had not understood at her accession, that courage was not enough, that an empire defended by an empty treasury and a broken army would always be at the mercy of the next Frederick. If she meant to hold her inheritance, and one day to recover what she had lost, she would have to do more than fight. She would have to rebuild the state itself, from the foundations up, into something strong enough to stand. And to that great work, the remaking of the Habsburg monarchy, she now turned the full force of her formidable mind. There was one prize the war restored to her family, and it touched her closely, for it concerned the husband she loved. When the Bavarian who had seized the imperial dignity died in 1745, the crown fell vacant once more, and Maria Theresa was determined that it should come back where she felt it belonged, to the House of Austria, by way of her husband. She could not wear it herself, for it could go only to a man chosen by the prince-electors of Germany, and so the crown she could not hold she set out to win for Francis Stephen, that he might be emperor, and she empress at his side, and the honour of it restored to her family through the marriage she had fought so hard to make. She got it, by a mixture of military success, hard bargaining, and the simple fact that the Habsburg cause was now plainly in the ascendant. The election was secured, and in the autumn of that year Francis Stephen was chosen Holy Roman Emperor and crowned as Francis I. The crown that had been wrenched away returned to her household, and Maria Theresa had the deep satisfaction of seeing the man she loved invested with the highest dignity in the German world, and of taking her own place beside him as empress. The election was held at Frankfurt, the ancient place of the imperial coronations, and there in the old cathedral, Francis Stephen was crowned and anointed with all the heavy medieval splendour of the rite. The German princes and prelates gathered, the regalia of 1,000 years brought out, the new emperor invested with the crown and the orb and the sword. Maria Theresa did not take part in the ceremony, for she had no formal place in it. But there is a story, very much in character, that she watched the whole thing from a balcony or a window above the square, and that when her husband appeared in his imperial robes, she forgot her dignity entirely and cried out and waved and led the cheering for him with open, unguarded delight, a wife rejoicing in her husband's honour before the assembled world. It has the ring of truth, for she was always wholehearted in her loves, and the sight of Francis crowned at last was the fulfilment of a long and stubborn hope. But the title, splendid as it was, did not change where the power actually lay, and everyone understood the truth of the arrangement, including Francis himself. The imperial crown was a dignity, an ancient honour, but the real authority in their partnership, the rule over the vast Habsburg lands that were the true foundation of their strength, belonged to Maria Theresa and to no one else. Francis was emperor. Maria Theresa was the ruler. He presided, he lent his name and his title to the cause. He managed certain things and managed them well, finance above all, for he had a real gift for money and made himself and the family enormously rich. But the governing of the realm, the great decisions of war and peace and reform, the hard daily labour of holding the empire together, all of that was hers. It was an unusual marriage in this as in so much else. The wife held the power and the husband held the title, and both of them knew it, and the arrangement worked more or less because she loved him and he did not greatly mind. It is worth pausing on Francis here, because he is easy to overlook beside his towering wife, and that would be unfair to both of them. He was not a great man, but he was a likeable and a useful one. He had been stripped of his ancestral Lorraine to make the marriage possible, and he never quite got over the loss of it. He was given Tuscany in exchange, and the imperial title to crown his career, but he remained, in the deep structure of the partnership, the lesser figure, the consort to a reigning queen. He bore it, on the whole, with good humour. He found his outlets where he could, in his financial speculations, which made fortunes, in the sciences and collections he patronised, in the pleasures and the discreet infidelities that his wife knew of and grieved over and forgave. He gave her, above all, the thing she needed most and valued most, a marriage and a family and a domestic happiness at the centre of a life otherwise given over to the crushing labour of rule. Whatever his failings, he was the great love of her life, and the home they made together was the still point around which her whole world turned. For the moment, with the war won, and the inheritance saved, and the imperial crown restored to her household, Maria Theresa stood at a kind of summit. She had come through the testing. The young, untrained queen who had been expected to lose everything had kept her empire, defied her enemies, secured the imperial dignity for her husband, and emerged, against every expectation, as one of the formidable rulers of Europe. She was still young, not yet 30, with the bulk of her reign and her great work still before her. The family was growing, the dynasty was secure, the House of Austria, which had seemed about to be torn apart, stood whole and even strengthened around her. And yet she was not a woman to rest on a victory, least of all a victory shadowed by the loss of Silesia. She had learned in the hard years of the war exactly how weak the structure she had inherited truly was, how close she had come to ruin, how little a brave queen could do against a strong enemy when her treasury was empty and her army a shambles. The peace gave her something she had not had since her accession time, and a measure of security in which to set things right, and she meant to use it. She turned now from the defence of her inheritance to its transformation, from the soldier's work of holding the line to the ruler's work of building something that would never again be so vulnerable. The second great act of her reign was beginning, quieter than the first, without the drama of armies and appeals, but in its way more important, the long, patient, formidable labour by which Maria Theresa remade her empire into a modern state. The transformation of Maria Theresa from a brave young queen fighting for survival into a great reforming ruler is one of the quietly astonishing things in her story, because she did it largely by teaching herself in office while carrying and bearing child after child, by sheer application and a sound practical instinct that no tutor had ever cultivated in her. She had come to the throne knowing almost nothing of government. She made herself, over the years that followed, into one of the most effective administrators of the age, not through any flash of genius, but through an enormous capacity for work, a clear eye for talent, and a stubborn refusal to leave a problem unsolved. She rose early. She worked through mountains of paper. She questioned her ministers closely. She insisted on understanding things herself rather than taking them on trust. The empire was governed, in the end, by her own hand. Picture her in the small hours of a Vienna morning, the candles still burning against the dark, the palace asleep around her, the empress already at her desk in a plain wrap, working through the folders of reports and petitions and dispatches that came up to her from every corner of her sprawling lands. She read them through. She wrote her comments in the margins in her own hand, blunt and shrewd and to the point. She summoned the minister responsible and questioned him until she had got to the bottom of the matter, for she had a horror of being managed and a determination to know the truth of things for her own part. The sheer volume of it would have crushed most rulers, the endless paper of a composite state, and she ploughed through it year after year, decade after decade, with a stamina that astonished everyone who served her. It was unglamorous, exhausting, invisible labour, and it was the real foundation of her power. She understood after the war exactly what was wrong, and she set about fixing it with a clear and ruthless purpose. The war had shown her that the Habsburg state was too weak, too poor, too disorganized, too dependent on the goodwill of jealous local estates to defend itself against a determined enemy. The cure was to make it stronger, richer, and far more centralized, to gather power inward toward the crown and the capital, to build a standing army that did not depend on the whims of provincial assemblies, and to raise the steady revenue that such an army required. This meant a long campaign against the old order, against the entrenched privileges of the nobility and the estates, who had always granted their taxes grudgingly and guarded their exemptions fiercely. Maria Theresa, devout and conservative by temperament, was no revolutionary, but where the strength of the state was concerned, she was relentless, and she set out to make even the nobles and the clergy pay their share toward the defense of the realm. She did it, as all great rulers do, through the men she chose to serve her, and her gift for choosing was one of her surest strengths. She found and promoted able administrators and gave them their head, men who could turn her purposes into working machinery. Foremost among them in these years was a Silesian nobleman named Haugwitz, who became the architect of her great administrative and financial reforms, reorganizing the tangled overlapping authorities of the monarchy into something more like a single centrally directed state, prizing the control of taxation and the army away from the provincial estates and gathering it into the hands of the crown. It was patient, unglamorous, deeply contested work, fought out province by province and privilege by privilege, and it laid the foundations of the modern Austrian state. Behind the reformers stood always the will of the empress, who backed her ministers against the howls of the offended nobility and saw the work through. The army was rebuilt. The shambolic, under-strength force that had nearly lost her everything was reorganized into a proper standing army, larger, better paid, better trained, supported by the steadier revenue the reforms now produced. A military academy was founded to train officers. The artillery was improved. The whole instrument of war was professionalized. She knew she would need it, for the recovery of Silesia was never out of her mind, and she meant, when the time came, to to face Frederick again with a very different army from the one he had brushed aside in 1740. The rebuilding of the army was, in a sense, the rebuilding of everything else made visible, the hard military point of a vast effort to make the monarchy strong. And the reforms did not stop at the army and the treasury. Once the machinery of a stronger central state was in place, Maria Theresa turned it to the improvement of her subjects' lives in ways that reached far beyond the battlefield. She reformed the law, the administration of justice, the management of the economy. She took an interest, unusual for a sovereign of her time, in the welfare and the education and even the health of ordinary people across her sprawling realm. She was building not merely a war machine, but a state in the fuller sense, an apparatus that governed and ordered and improved, and she pursued it with the same tireless application she brought to everything. Much of what we recognize as the modern Austrian state, its administration, its army, its schools, its very habit of central government, can be traced to the patient remaking she carried out in these middle years of her reign. It was, in its way, a greater achievement than the winning of the war, and a more lasting one. Anyone can rise to a crisis who has the nerve for it, and Maria Theresa had the nerve, but the long, grinding, unglamorous labour of remaking a state, year after year, against entrenched resistance, with no drama to sustain it and no glory at the end, takes a different and rarer kind of strength, the strength of sustained purpose, and she had that too. The frightened girl who had thrown herself on the mercy of the Hungarians had become a working empress, sitting at her desk in the small hours, mastering the dispatches, driving her ministers, bending a reluctant empire slowly to her will. And all the while she was doing something else as well, something that would have been a full life's work for most women, and that she carried alongside the governing of an empire as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She was raising a family of extraordinary size and pouring into it the same fierce energy she poured into everything. For Maria Theresa, the great ruler, was also, and never let anyone forget it, a mother. To see what her reforms meant, you have to come down out of the council chambers and into the ordinary life of the empire, into a village in Bohemia or a provincial town in the Austrian lands, because the great changes Maria Theresa drove through did not stay on paper. Over the years they reached down and altered the texture of ordinary lives, and that was new. Imagine a small village schoolroom that did not exist before her reign, and existed after it. A plain room, a master paid a modest wage, a class of village children, the sons and daughters of peasants and tradesmen, being taught their letters and their numbers and their catechism. For one of the things this devout, conservative, intensely practical empress decided in the calm of her middle years was that the children of her realm should be schooled, all of them, even the poorest, and she set in motion a great reform of education that aimed with remarkable ambition for the age at something close to universal elementary schooling across her lands. It was an extraordinary aim, and she pursued it with characteristic thoroughness. Schools were to be founded across the empire, in the towns and reaching out into the villages. Teachers were to be trained, a standard system of instruction was laid down, and the principle was established far ahead of most of Europe that the education of the common people was a proper concern of the state. She did not do it out of any modern notion of equality, for she had none. She did it because she believed that a well-ordered Christian realm needed subjects who could read and reckon and knew their duties, and because the same instinct that drove her to build a stronger army and a fuller treasury drove her also to build a more capable people. Whatever the motive, the effect was real and lasting, and a peasant child in the Austrian lands in the later years of her reign had a chance at the rudiments of learning that such a child had never had before. The same reforming hand reached into the health of her subjects, and here she was served by one of the most important of the men she gathered around her, a Dutch physician named Gerard van Swieten, whom she brought to Vienna and set over the medical and academic life of the monarchy. Under his direction, the teaching of medicine was overhauled, the university reformed and dragged out of its medieval torpor, the training of doctors improved, and the first steps taken towards something like a public concern for the health of the population. The dread of smallpox, that killer of the age which would in time strike her own family with terrible force, drove an interest in inoculation that Maria Theresa, having suffered the disease herself and lost children to it, came to support. The state began haltingly to take responsibility for the bodies of its subjects as well as their souls and their schooling. She reformed the law too, and the administration of justice, codifying and ordering where there had been a tangle of local custom, and moving, though slowly and against her own conservative grain, toward a more humane practice. The cruelty of the old criminal law, with its torture and its savage punishments, sat uneasily even with a ruler as orthodox as she was, and over the course of her reign the use of judicial torture was curtailed, and at last, under the pressure of her son and the spirit of the age, abolished in her lands a real advance toward a gentler justice. She built roads and encouraged trade and reformed the coinage and took a census of her peoples, the unglamorous infrastructure of a governed state, the things that do not make for stirring stories, but that change, slowly and permanently, the lives of millions. Through all of it ran the same paradox that makes her such a fascinating figure. She was a deeply conservative woman, devout to the point of intolerance, suspicious of new ideas, and the men who preached them, who nonetheless presided over one of the great reforming reigns of the 18th century. She was not an enlightened despot in the manner of her rival Frederick or her own radical son. She distrusted the fashionable philosophy of the age and the free thinkers who carried it, and she would have been horrified to be called a child of the Enlightenment. And yet, driven by her practical genius and her sense of duty and her relentless will to strengthen her realm, she remade her empire along lines that the reformers of the age could only applaud, building schools and reforming medicine and codifying law and curbing cruelty, dragging her conservative monarchy, half against her own instincts, into the modern world. She reformed not because she loved progress, but because she loved her state and meant to make it strong and well-ordered, and the two purposes in her hands came to much the same thing. What it added up to across the long middle years of her reign was a transformation as profound as any in the history of her house. The weak, scattered, near-bankrupt inheritance she had taken up in the chaos of 1740 had become, by patient labour, a stronger, richer, more unified, better-governed state, with a real army and a fuller treasury and schools and reformed courts and a central administration that answered to the crown. She had not done it for glory, and there was little glory in it. She had done it at her desk in the small hours, year after year, dispatch by dispatch, reform by reform, against the resistance of every entrenched interest in the empire. And she had done it all while running, at the same time, the largest and most demanding household in Europe, for the empress who was remaking a state was also the mother of a brood of children, and to understand her fully, we must now leave the council chamber and step into the other half of her life, the rooms where she was not a sovereign at all, but a parent, fierce and tender and endlessly anxious, presiding over a nursery that was also a dynasty. Come with me, then, into the private world of the court, into the palace of Schönbrunn on the edge of Vienna, the summer residence she loved, with its long ochre-yellow front and its formal gardens climbing the hill behind to the airy colonnade at the top. Picture the rooms within, the white and gold, the mirrors and the painted ceilings, the porcelain stoves in the corners breathing out their warmth against the Austrian winter, the lacquered cabinets and the family portraits crowding the walls, and picture, moving through them with a brisk, unhurried authority, the Empress herself, no longer the slender bride of the love match, but a woman grown stout with many children and many years, plainly and richly dressed, her manner direct and warm and entirely without pretension. This was the centre of her world, and it tells us as much about her as any battlefield or council chamber. Her days were ordered by a discipline that never slackened. She rose early, very early, and was at her papers while much of her court still slept, for the empire did not govern itself, and she trusted no one else to govern it. The hours were divided between the relentless business of state and the duties of her faith and the affairs of her enormous family, and she moved between them with a tireless energy that exhausted those around her. Her piety was woven through everything. She heard Mass daily, kept the fasts and the feasts with rigour, filled her private rooms with devotional images, and saw the hand of God in every event of her life and reign. It was a faith without subtlety, and without doubt, the bedrock of her whole character, and it made her, by turns, a tender benefactor and a harsh persecutor, for she could be boundlessly kind and bleakly intolerant out of the very same conviction, and she had a temper and a warmth that no amount of imperial dignity could discipline out of her. She was not a cold or a distant sovereign. She was vivid, emotional, outspoken, quick to anger and quick to forgive, given to plain speech and sudden tears and gusts of affection. She scolded her ministers and her children with the same frank energy she brought to everything, and she loved them, many of them with a fierce, open-handed warmth. There was nothing of the marble idol about her. She was intensely, almost overwhelmingly human, a great ruler who never stopped being a wife and a mother and a woman of large and unguarded feeling. People who came to her braced for the chill of majesty often found instead a stout, kindly, formidable woman who looked them in the eye and spoke to them directly and remembered the details of their lives. And there was music, always music. For Vienna in her reign was becoming the musical heart of Europe, and the court was full of it. She had loved music since she was a girl singing in the family entertainments, and she filled her palaces with it, with the operas and the chamber concerts and the church music that were the glory of the age. It is in this musical Vienna that one of the most charming scenes of her whole life takes place, a scene that has come down to us across the centuries with the freshness of something that really happened. In the autumn of the year 1762, a small boy of 6 was brought to Schönbrunn to perform before the Empress and her family, a prodigy from Salzburg, whose gifts were already the wonder of musical Europe. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Picture the scene in the mirrored music room, the tiny boy at the keyboard, playing with a mastery that should have been impossible at his age, the Empress and the Emperor and the imperial children gathered to watch, the whole court charmed and astonished. And then, the story goes, the little boy, finished and unafraid, scrambled up into the lap of the great Empress of Austria and threw his arms about her neck and kissed her with the perfect confidence of a child who knew nothing of majesty. And she, the ruler of an empire, the mother of 16, was delighted and held him and made much of him. There is a further thread to the tale that has charmed every teller since, that the small Mozart, slipping on the polished floor, was helped up by one of the imperial children, a little archduchess near his own age, and that he declared, with a child's gallantry, that he would marry her one day. The archduchess was Marie Antoinette. It is the kind of story that may have grown in the telling, but it joins, in one bright moment, the prodigy who would become the greatest composer of the age, and the child who would become the most famous and most tragic queen, both of them gathered for an afternoon in the warmth of Maria Theresa's court. That court, for all its formality, was at heart a family home, and it is the family that we keep circling back to, Because for Maria Theresa, the family was never a thing apart from the empire, but bound up in the very centre of it. The same rooms saw the dispatches read and the children scolded, the ministers received and the babies nursed. The great ruler and the great mother were the same woman, in the same hours, in the same palace. She would not have understood a separation between them. Her children were her dynasty and her policy and her deepest love all at once, the heirs to her throne and the instruments of her diplomacy and the objects of her fierce maternal anxiety, and she poured into them an energy as great as any she gave to the governing of her lands. To know her we have to know them, this vast remarkable brood she raised in the palaces of Vienna. And so we come now to the nursery, and to the most demanding and most heartbreaking of all her many roles, the mother of 16 children. 16 children. The number is worth pausing over, for it is barely conceivable to us now, and it shaped the whole texture of her life, across roughly 20 years, from her first child in the early days of her marriage to her last in the 1750s. Maria Theresa was pregnant again and again and again, 16 times in all, bearing her children with a robustness that carried her through pregnancy after pregnancy, even as she fought wars and rebuilt a state and governed an empire. She did not retreat from rule to have her babies. She did both at once, reading dispatches between confinements, returning to her desk almost before she had risen from childbed, carrying the double burden of the most demanding throne in Europe and the largest nursery, and carrying it without complaint, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world for a woman to do. The 16 not all survived, for this was an age that buried its children no matter how high their birth, and the imperial nursery was not spared. Several of her children died young, of the smallpox and the other killers that no rank could keep out, and each loss struck her hard. For whatever her sternness, she felt these deaths as a mother feels them, deeply and lastingly. But many lived and grew, and the survivors made up a remarkable family, scattered in time across the thrones and palaces of Europe. There was the heir, Joseph, born in the year after her accession, the longed-for son, clever and difficult and impatient, who would grow into the great trial of her old age. There was Leopold, steadier than his brother, who would rule Tuscany and at last succeed to the empire. There were daughters in abundance, Maria Christina, whom she loved best of all, Maria Amalia, Maria Carolina, and the youngest of the surviving girls, born in the autumn of the year 1755, a child christened Maria Antonia, whom the world would come to know by the French form of her name, Marie Antoinette. Maria Theresa was a mother of fierce and anxious and controlling love, hands-on to a degree that astonished a court used to royal parents who left their children to servants. She concerned herself with everything, their health, their lessons, their manners, their characters, their marriages, their souls. She watched them closely, judged them shrewdly, and was not blind to their faults. Her assessments of her own children, set down in her letters and her notes, are clear-eyed to the point of severity. This one too proud, that one too idle, this one weak, that one wild. She loved them, and she did not flatter them, and she meant to form them by close attention and constant instruction into worthy bearers of their name. It was love expressed as supervision, warmth delivered with a stern hand, and her children grew up under the weight of it, some flourishing and some chafing. Nothing in their upbringing was left to chance. She laid down detailed written instructions for the governesses and tutors who had the daily charge of her children, regulating their hours, their lessons, their food, their prayers, their amusements, their very characters. With the same exacting thoroughness, she brought to a reform of the army or the treasury. The children were to rise and pray and study and dine by the clock. Their faults were to be watched and corrected. Their progress was to be reported to her, for she read these reports and minded them and intervened. She had her favourites and her disappointments, and she hid neither, setting out in her notes, child by child, the particular failing she saw and the particular work she thought each one needed. It was a regime of love conducted like a department of state, and it produced sovereigns and queens, and also a good deal of quiet rebellion. And she did not stop when they grew up and went away, for one of the most remarkable things about her motherhood is how it followed her children across borders and across the years. When her daughters married, as they did, into the ruling houses of Europe, she did not let them go. She pursued them with letters, a ceaseless stream of advice and instruction and reproach and love, telling them how to behave, how to please their husbands, how to keep their faith, how to carry themselves, how to manage their new courts. The daughter who married into Naples, the daughter who went to Parma, and above all the youngest who went to France, all of them received from their formidable mother a constant correspondence that mixed tenderness and anxiety and command in equal measure. The great empress reaching out from Vienna to govern the conduct of her grown daughters in distant kingdoms as she had governed them in the nursery. The marriages themselves were policy, of course, for this was the other face of her motherhood, the dynastic face. Maria Theresa used her children, her daughters especially, as the instruments of her foreign policy, marrying them into the courts of Europe to build the alliances her empire needed, so that her family became, in time, a web of connection spanning the continent, and she earned her later title as a kind of mother-in-law to half of Europe. She arranged these matches with the same calculating care she brought to a treaty, weighing the advantage to her house and her policy, and her daughters went where they were sent, as royal daughters did, to serve the interests of the family. And yet there was one exception that tells us something important about her. For the daughter she loved best, Maria Christina, she allowed to marry for love, to wed the man of her own choosing, rather than the partner policy would have dictated, a privilege granted to no other of her children, and resented by some of them. It was a flash of the romantic heart beneath the calculating ruler, the woman who had herself married for love unable, in the one case she loved most, to deny it to her child. So this was the other empire she governed, the human one, the great sprawling family that was at once her deepest love, her heaviest anxiety, and her chief instrument of policy, raised under her close fierce eye, and dispatched one by one to the thrones of Europe to do their dynastic duty. It was a life's work in itself, and she carried it alongside the governing of her lands as though the two were one, which to her they were. And among all those children, watched and instructed and married off across the continent, there was the youngest girl, the pretty, lively, somewhat heedless child of her later years, the one she would worry over most and prepare most carefully, and send furthest away to the greatest and most dangerous of all the thrones. But the match that would carry Marie Antoinette to France lay a little ahead, and it grew out of one of the great strokes of Maria Theresa's statecraft, a complete reversal of the alliances of Europe that astonished the continent. And to that we must turn before we can follow the youngest daughter on her fateful journey over the Alps. All through the years of rebuilding, one purpose burned steadily beneath the rest, the recovery of Silesia and the humbling of the man who had taken it. Maria Theresa never reconciled herself to the loss. The rich province torn from her in the first weeks of her reign sat in Prussian hands like a splinter in the flesh. And Frederick, the cold aggressor who had begun her troubles and profited most from them, remained the great enemy of her imagination, the figure she most wanted to defeat. She had rebuilt her army and her treasury in large part with him in mind, and as the years of peace went on, she and her ministers turned their thoughts to the question of how the lost province might be won back, and the upstart king of Prussia brought low. The answer her ministers devised was one of the most startling reversals in the whole history of European diplomacy, and it is associated above all with one man, the supremely able and supple statesman who became the architect of her foreign policy, Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz. Kaunitz was a figure of brilliant, almost eccentric refinement, fastidious and vain and hypochondriac, but possessed of one of the sharpest political minds of the age, and he saw clearly what would be needed to defeat Prussia. Prussia could not be beaten by Austria alone. She would need powerful allies, and the most powerful possible ally was the very power that had been Austria's hereditary enemy for 2.5 centuries, France. This was the heart of the Great Reversal. For generations beyond memory, the deepest fixed fact of European politics had been the enmity between Habsburg Austria and Bourbon France, the two Catholic powers locked in a rivalry that had shaped the continent's wars for 200 years and more. To propose an alliance between them was to propose turning the world upside down, to ask two ancient enemies to forget the hatred of centuries and stand together. And yet Kaunitz argued, and Maria Theresa came to agree, that the old enmity no longer served Austria's interest, that the real and rising danger was now Prussia, and that the path to Silesia ran through Versailles. Urgently, secretly, with immense diplomatic skill, Kaunitz set to work to bring about the impossible, to detach the French from their long understanding with Prussia and bind them instead to Austria. He succeeded, and the success rang across Europe like a thunderclap. In the year 1756, the Great Reversal was accomplished. France and Austria, enemies for 2 centuries, came to terms and made common cause, while Prussia, suddenly isolated, threw herself into the arms of Britain, France's rival. The whole alliance system of Europe had been turned inside out almost overnight. The old friendships dissolved and the old enmities reversed, in what came to be called, with good reason, the diplomatic revolution. It was a triumph of Habsburg statecraft, of Kaunitz's cunning, and Maria Theresa's steady backing, and it seemed to set the stage at last for the recovery of Silesia, for now Austria would face Prussia, not alone, but at the head of a mighty coalition, with the power of France beside her, and the resources of half of Europe in the scale. For Maria Theresa it was the fruit of years of patient preparation, and it carried a personal sweetness, for it brought within reach the one thing she most wanted, the chance to face Frederick again on equal or better terms, and take back what he had stolen. The empire she had rebuilt was ready, the army was reformed, the treasury was filled, and now, by the masterstroke of the reversal of alliances, the diplomatic isolation that had doomed her in the First War was undone, and Prussia stood where Austria had stood before, hemmed in by enemies. The trap that had been sprung on her in 1740 seemed about to be sprung on her enemy in turn, and yet the seeds of a second tragedy were already sown in this brilliant triumph, though no one could see them yet. The alliance with France would bind the two houses ever closer, and it would be sealed, in time, by a marriage, the marriage of Maria Theresa's youngest daughter to the heir of the French throne, a match meant to cement the reversal and bind the two crowns together for a generation. That marriage would carry a Habsburg archduchess to Versailles, and to a destiny that no one in 1756 could have imagined. But that lay far ahead, for now there was only the gleaming prospect of revenge and recovery, the great coalition assembled, the army ready, the lost province almost within her grasp. Maria Theresa had laboured a decade and a half toward this moment. In 1756, the second great war of her reign began, and with it her best and last real chance to undo the wound of Silesia. The war that followed was the long Prussian struggle, and it was a vast and terrible one, far larger than the conflict over the Austrian succession, a war that spread beyond Europe to the colonies and the seas, and is sometimes reckoned the first truly global war. At its European heart, though, it was the duel Maria Theresa had spent 16 years readying herself for, the trial of strength between Habsburg Austria and her coalition on the one side and Frederick's Prussia, backed by Britain on the other, fought above all for the prize of Silesia. And it began with Frederick, characteristically, striking first for the King of Prussia. Seeing the coalition assembling against him, did not wait to be attacked, but flung himself upon his enemies in a desperate preemptive blow, invading Saxony and opening the war on his own terms. For a time it seemed that the long preparation might pay off. The coalition arrayed against Frederick was formidable: Austria and France and Russia and the lesser German states. An overwhelming weight of numbers and resources that should, by every calculation, have crushed the King of Prussia and his single ally. Maria Theresa's reformed army, the instrument she had rebuilt with such care, took the field a very different force from the shambles of 1740, and it gave Frederick some of the hardest fighting of his life. That there were Austrian victories, real and heartening ones, battles where the white-coated imperial infantry stood and fought and beat the famous Prussians, moments when it seemed that Silesia would be recovered and Frederick brought to his knees at last. There was one summer day, early in the war, when an Austrian army caught Frederick himself in the open in Bohemia and beat him in a pitched battle. The King of Prussia, driven from the field for the first time in years, his aura of invincibility broken, his advance into the Habsburg lands flung back. The news of it ran through Vienna like fire. Bells were rung, thanksgiving sung, and Maria Theresa, who had waited so long to see her enemy humbled, struck a special decoration to reward the commanders and the soldiers who had done it, a military order of merit that bound the glory of that day to her own name and survives to this day. It was the kind of moment she had dreamed of through all the years of preparation, the proof that her rebuilt army could stand against the best soldier in Europe and win, and for a season it seemed the whole tide of the war had turned and the lost province lay within her grasp. The Austrian commanders had learned their trade. The army she had built proved its worth, and the great enemy was pressed harder than he had ever been pressed. But Frederick was a soldier of genius, perhaps the greatest of the age, and he fought with a speed and a daring and a refusal to accept defeat that again and again pulled him back from the edge of ruin. Outnumbered, surrounded, written off, he struck in unexpected directions, won battles he had no business winning, and held his small kingdom together through years of pressure that would have broken a lesser man. The war swayed back and forth across the German lands, victory and defeat alternating, neither side able to land the final blow, the coalition's advantage of numbers blunted by its own divisions, and Frederick's brilliance, and the sheer difficulty of finishing off so resourceful an enemy. Season after season the armies marched and fought and wintered and marched again, and the lost province changed hands and changed back, and the decision would not come. For Maria Theresa, watching from Vienna, the war was a long agony of hope and disappointment. She followed the campaigns closely, rejoiced in the victories, grieved over the defeats, poured her empire's strength into the struggle, and held to her purpose through all the reverses. She wanted Silesia, she wanted Frederick humbled, she had built everything toward this, and she would not let go. But the cost mounted season on season, in men and in money, the treasury she had so carefully filled, draining away again into the bottomless pit of war, the young men of her lands dying in the terrible battles, the suffering spreading across the German countryside. And still the decision would not come, still Frederick would not be beaten, still Silesia hung in the balance, neither won nor finally lost. There came a moment, late in the war, when it seemed that fortune would at last deliver the enemy into her hands. The coalition's pressure had worn Frederick down to the edge of destruction. His armies were shrinking, his resources exhausted, his kingdom near collapse, and it seemed that one more push would finish him, and the long labour would be crowned with success. Frederick himself, in those dark days, despaired, and is said to have carried poison against the possibility of final defeat. The recovery of Silesia, the humbling of Prussia, the vindication of all Maria Theresa's patient years, hung within reach. And then, at the very moment of his greatest peril, Frederick was saved, not by his own genius this time, but by a stroke of fortune so complete that it has gone down in history as a miracle, the sudden collapse of the coalition arrayed against him through a change of ruler in one of its greatest members. For the alliance that had pinned Frederick down depended on Russia, and the Russian empress who had pursued the war against him with implacable hatred died, and her successor, who admired Frederick to the point of worship, at once reversed his country's policy, abandoned the coalition, and made peace with the man his predecessor had sought to destroy. At a stroke, the great combination fell apart. The pressure on Prussia was lifted, and Frederick, who had been all but finished, was reprieved. It was a calamity for Maria Theresa, the snatching away of victory at the very moment it seemed assured, and it broke the back of her long effort. Without Russia, the coalition could not deliver the final blow, and the war, which had cost so much and come so close, ground at last toward an exhausted and bitter end, with the great prize still unwon. And so the war ended, after 7 years of bloodshed and ruin, in failure for the cause that had driven Maria Theresa for more than 2 decades. The peace that closed it, concluded at Hubertusburg in 1763, settled the long quarrel on terms that were for her a bitter draught indeed. Silesia stayed Prussian. After all the rebuilding and all the diplomacy, and all the years of preparation, up to the reversal of alliances, and the assembling of a mighty coalition, and the pouring out of her empire's blood and treasure, the province she had been determined to recover remained in the hands of the man who had stolen it, and she was forced to acknowledge, formally and finally, what she had spent half her reign refusing to accept. Silesia was lost, and lost for good. It was the great defeat of her life, and she felt it as such. She had not merely failed to win the province back, she had spent enormous resources and countless lives in the attempt and come away with nothing. The empire exhausted, the treasury drained, a generation of young men dead in the great battles, and the hated Frederick not humbled but confirmed, his theft made permanent, his kingdom raised by the long ordeal into the front rank of European powers. The whole edifice of her foreign policy, the patient labour of those long years of waiting, the masterstroke of the diplomatic revolution, had been built toward this single end, and the end had not been achieved. For a ruler of her pride and her determination, the failure cut deep. But here we see something that distinguishes the mature Maria Theresa from the young queen who had refused all compromise in 1740, and it is to her great credit. She learned from the defeat. The young woman had been all fire and will, scorning every counsel of prudence, staking everything on courage. The older woman, chastened by the terrible cost of the 7 Years' War, drew from it a hard and lasting lesson about the limits of ambition and the price of war, and she became, for the rest of her reign, a force for peace. She had seen what war cost, in lives and money and suffering, and having failed to win her object by it, she resolved not to be drawn into such ruinous adventures again. The recovery of Silesia, the dream of 20 years, she let go at last, and turned her energies back to the things she could achieve, the strengthening and the governing and the improving of the lands she still held. This was the wisdom of defeat, and it set her sharply apart from her great rival. Frederick remained to the end a gambler and a conqueror, ready to seize and to risk. Maria Theresa, burned by the fire of that long war, became the advocate of caution and restraint, the voice in the councils of Europe and within her own family urging against war, against aggression, against the reckless pursuit of gain at the cost of blood. It was a stance that would put her in her later years increasingly at odds with her own son and heir, the restless Joseph, who chafed at his mother's caution and longed for the bold strokes and the territorial gains that she had come to distrust. The clash between the war-weary mother and the ambitious son would be one of the themes of her old age. But the lesson she had learned was a true one, bought at a terrible price, and it made her later rule wiser and gentler than her early rule had been. For the Empire, the end of the 7 Years' War opened a long stretch of peace, and Maria Theresa used it as she had used the peace after the First War to rebuild and reform and govern. The exhausted treasury was slowly refilled, the wounds of the war were bound up. The work of administration and improvement went on. The middle decades of her reign, for all the failure of the Silesian dream, were decades of solid achievement at home, the strengthening of the state, the founding of schools, the reform of law and medicine and economy, the patient labour by which she made her monarchy stronger and better ordered than she had found it. If she could not have the glory of conquest, she would have the more lasting glory of good government, and she pursued it with her old tireless energy. And so she came into the later phase of her reign, a woman in her late 40s and 50s now, stout and grey and formidable, the great matriarch of her house and her empire, her wars behind her, her reforms bearing fruit, her vast family growing toward the age of marriages and alliances. She had failed in her one great ambition and made her peace with the failure. She had succeeded beyond all expectation in the larger work of holding and remaking her inheritance. She stood secure, respected, the senior sovereign of Catholic Europe, the woman who had held the House of Austria together against all the odds. But the years of her greatest happiness were quietly drawing to a close, for the long peace that followed the war would bring her, before many years had passed, the heaviest blow of her whole life, heavier than any defeat in the field, the loss of the one person who had been the still centre of her world through every trial. The husband she loved was nearing the end of his days, and his death would change her utterly. The blow fell in the summer of the year 1765, and it fell without warning, in the midst of a family celebration, which made it crueler still. The court had travelled to Innsbruck, in the Tyrol, for the wedding of one of her sons, the steadier of the two elder boys, Leopold, who was to marry a Spanish princess, and the festivities were in full swing, the family gathered, the mood high, when the Emperor Francis, Maria Theresa's husband of nearly 3 decades, the great love of her life, was suddenly taken ill. He had complained of feeling unwell. He rose from an evening at the theatre or the celebrations, and in a corridor of the palace, hurrying or pausing, he collapsed, struck down by a seizure of the heart, and within moments, before help could reach him or his wife could be summoned, he was dead. He was in his late 50s. There had been no illness to prepare her, no slow decline, no chance to say goodbye. He was alive and well 1 hour, and gone the next. Picture the evening as it must have been, the palace at Innsbruck bright with the wedding festivities, the music and the company, the family gathered in high spirits for the marriage of a son, the emperor, genial and at ease, as he always was on such occasions, moving among the guests. And then the sudden faltering, the hand to the chest, the stumble in a corridor away from the crowd, and the easy, charming man crumpling to the floor with no one able to save him. Maria Theresa was not at his side at the end. She was somewhere in the bright rooms, amid the celebration, when the word was brought to her that her husband had been stricken, and by the time she reached him, or was kept from reaching him, it was already over. The festivity of one moment became the catastrophe of the next. The wedding turned in an hour into a death, and the woman who had loved this man for 30 years was a widow before she had even understood that he was ill. For Maria Theresa, it was the end of the world. She had loved this man since she was a child of 6. She had held out against the whole machinery of dynastic marriage to win him. She had loved him wholeheartedly and without wavering for 30 years, through his charm and his idleness and his infidelities and all, forgiving him everything, holding him at the centre of her life. He had been her one refuge from the crushing labour of rule, the still point of her private world, the father of her 16 children, the companion of her whole adult life. And now, in an instant, with no warning at all, he was taken from her, and the grief that engulfed her was total and, in a sense, permanent. She never recovered from it. The death of Francis divided her life in two, in the years when she had him and the long widowhood when she did not, and the second part was lived in the shadow of the first. Her mourning was extravagant, prolonged, and entirely sincere, and it became a kind of permanent condition. She cut off her hair, the old gesture of a grief beyond consolation. She put aside her coloured gowns and dressed for the rest of her days in the black of mourning, wearing widow's weeds for a decade and a half, until her own death, so that the whole later image of her, the stout, grave woman in black, is the image of a widow who never left off mourning her husband. She withdrew for a time into her grief, shutting herself away, refusing the world. She turned the rooms where he had died, and the day of his death, into objects of a devotion that bordered on the morbid, marking the anniversaries, dwelling on the loss, keeping count, in a private record, of the exact number of days and weeks and months she had been parted from him, as though the arithmetic of mourning could hold him a little closer. It changed her, and it aged her, and it cast a permanent shadow over the last 15 years of her reign. The woman who had been so full of life and warmth and energy did not lose those qualities entirely, but they were dimmed now by a settled sadness, a heaviness of spirit that never wholly lifted. She went on governing, for the empire still needed her, and duty still drove her, but she governed now as a widow in mourning, her old zest replaced by a kind of grim, dutiful perseverance. The death of Francis took something out of her that never came back, the joy at the centre of her life, and what remained was duty and faith and the love of her children and the long unhealing wound of his absence. And there was a further consequence of his passing beyond the private grief that would shape the politics of her last years. For Francis had been Holy Roman Emperor, and with his death the imperial title passed to their eldest son, Joseph, who became the Emperor Joseph II. More than that, in her first overwhelming grief, Maria Theresa took a step that would prove fateful. She made Joseph her co-regent in the Habsburg lands, sharing with her son the rule of the empire she had until now held alone. It was, in part, an act of a grieving woman seeking to share a burden suddenly grown too heavy, and in part a recognition that the heir must be brought into the work of government. But it joined together in the rule of the empire two people of utterly opposite temperament and conviction, the cautious, conservative, devout mother and the impatient, radical, reforming son, and it set the stage for the long and painful conflict that would fill her widowhood. So the death of Francis was a hinge in her life and in her reign together. It broke her heart, and it never wholly mended. It clothed her in the black she would wear to her grave, and it placed at her side, in the governing of her lands, a son whose every instinct ran counter to her own. The great partnership of her life, the love match that had been her private happiness through every public trial, was ended, and in its place came a new and difficult partnership of mother and son that would bring her as much grief in its way as the loss of her husband. The last act of her long reign was beginning, the act of the widowed empress, ruling on in her black gowns through her unhealing sorrow, with a brilliant, exasperating, beloved son pulling against her at every turn. The son who now stood at her side in the government of the empire was a remarkable man, and the conflict between them was not the petty friction of personalities, but a deep collision of two opposite visions of how a realm should be ruled. Joseph, the second, was clever, restless, idealistic, impatient, a true child of his century in a way his mother never was, steeped in the new philosophy of the Enlightenment, burning to reform and modernize and sweep away the cobwebs of the old order. Where Maria Theresa was devout, Joseph was skeptical and coolly tolerant in religion. Where she was cautious, he was bold to the point of recklessness. Where she reformed slowly and reluctantly, out of practical necessity, and against her conservative grain, he wanted to reform headlong, out of principle, tearing down and rebuilding by the light of reason. He was, in short, the model of the enlightened despot that his mother distrusted, and he chafed unbearably at the slow-hedged, pious caution of her rule. For 15 years they governed together, mother and son, in a partnership that was a long, grinding, often agonizing struggle. Joseph wanted to act. Maria Theresa wanted to wait. He pressed for sweeping religious toleration, for the curbing of the Church's power, for radical reforms of the state and society. She resisted, alarmed by his irreligion and his haste, fearful of the upheaval his schemes would bring. He admired their great enemy Frederick of Prussia as a fellow modern, a model of efficient power. She loathed Frederick as the author of all her troubles, and was wounded to the heart that her own son should look up to the man who had stolen Silesia. They quarrelled, reconciled, quarrelled again. Joseph more than once threatened to resign his share of the government in frustration. Maria Theresa wept and reproached and held on. The letters that passed between them, and the memoranda they wrote, are a remarkable record of two strong wills locked together, each loving the other and each unable to give way. The hardest part for her was that she could see his gifts, and even in part the justice of his views, and still could not bring herself to follow where he led. She knew he was able. She knew the world was changing. She was herself, for all her conservatism, one of the great reformers of the age. But Joseph's reforms came from a place she distrusted, from the cold light of reason rather than the warmth of faith and custom, and they moved at a speed that frightened her, and she feared, with some justice, that his headlong zeal would do as much harm as good. So she held him back, year after year, blunting his schemes, delaying his measures, insisting on caution, and he chafed and raged and submitted. And the great reforming reign he longed for had to wait until she was gone. When at last she died and he ruled alone, he would unleash a torrent of radical change that would shake the empire to its foundations, and in much of it fail. And there were those who said afterward that the old empress, in holding him back, had understood her peoples better than her brilliant son. But the conflict, bitter as it was, never broke the bond between them, for beneath all the quarrelling they loved each other, in the fierce, exasperated, unbreakable way of a strong mother and a strong son. She was proud of him even as she fought him. He revered her even as he strained against her. They were bound together by blood, and by the shared burden of rule, and by a real if stormy affection, and the long struggle between them was a family struggle, as much as a political one, fought out in the language of love and duty and reproach. Maria Theresa, who had lost her husband, clung the harder to her difficult son, needing him, leaning on him, fighting him, all at once. And Joseph, for all his impatience, could not bring himself to break with the formidable mother whose approval he never stopped wanting. It made for an unhappy and a divided government, and it weighed on her last years, this constant tension at the very head of the state, the pulling in opposite directions, the sense that the air was straining at the leash, and that the moment she let go the empire would be plunged into changes she dreaded. She governed her widowhood in a kind of double harness, yoked to a son who wanted to gallop where she wanted to walk, and the strain of it told on her, adding to the grief of her bereavement a constant low anxiety about the future, about what Joseph would do when she was gone, about whether the empire she had held together so carefully would survive his reforming zeal. And yet, through all the conflict, the work of government went on, and Maria Theresa kept her hand firmly on the larger course of the empire to the end. She was old and grieving and increasingly unwell, but she did not let go of the reins, and on the great questions she still, in the last resort, prevailed, holding her impatient son in check, keeping her realm on the cautious, steady path she trusted. The widow in black, mourning her husband and quarrelling with her son, was still the ruler, still the centre of the whole vast machine, still working through her papers in the small hours, still bending the empire to her will. But her strength was failing now, and her family, her consolation and her anxiety was about to be struck by a series of blows that would test even her formidable endurance, for in the time of her widowhood, death came again and again to the imperial nursery in a form that no rebuilt army or reformed treasury could keep out. The killer that came for her family in this season was smallpox, the great scourge of the 18th century, a disease that struck rich and poor alike, and that no palace wall could keep out, and it haunted the house of Habsburg with a particular cruelty. Maria Theresa had reason to dread it above all other afflictions, for it had already touched her family and would touch it again and again, carrying off her children and her children's spouses, scarring the survivors, and at last striking the Empress herself. The story of her later years is shadowed by this disease, as her early years were shadowed by war, and she fought it, in the end, with the same practical determination she brought to every enemy, though against smallpox even her formidable will could do only so much. The blows came in succession. The disease took children of hers in their youth. It took the wives that her sons had married, struck down in the bloom of life. It reached into the heart of her carefully arranged dynastic plans and shattered them. One of the cruelest losses came when smallpox killed a daughter who had been promised in marriage to the King of Naples on the very eve of the match, and Maria Theresa, with the hard practicality that grief never quite drove out of her, sent another daughter in the dead girl's place, so that the alliance should not be lost. It is a detail that shocks the modern heart and tells us much about her world, that even in the depths of a mother's grief the dynastic machine ground on, and a living daughter was substituted for a dead one to keep a treaty whole. The daughter who went to Naples in her sister's place was Maria Carolina, who would become a formidable queen in her own right, and the sister whose death sent her there was one of several the disease devoured. And then, in the year 1767, the smallpox came for Maria Theresa herself. She fell gravely ill, so ill that her life was despaired of, and the court prepared for the death of the Empress. The last rites were administered, the succession readied, the whole empire held its breath. She was a woman in her 50s, worn by grief and overwork, and the disease that had killed so many of her family seemed about to kill her too. But she survived. Her strong constitution, the same robustness that had carried her through 16 pregnancies, pulled her through where others had died, and she recovered, scarred but alive, having looked death full in the face. The brush with her own mortality, coming on top of all the other losses, deepened still further the sombre, death-haunted cast of her widowhood, but it did not break her, and she returned to her work as soon as she was able. What it did do was confirm her in a resolve that does her great credit, and that shows the practical reformer triumphing over the conservative in a matter of survival itself. Having suffered the disease herself, and lost so many of her family to it, Maria Theresa threw her weight behind the new and controversial practice of inoculation, the deliberate giving of a mild case of smallpox to ward off a deadly one, which was then spreading through Europe against much resistance and superstition. She had her own surviving children inoculated, setting an example to her court and her subjects, and she promoted the practice across her lands, using her authority to push a life-saving innovation against the fears and prejudices of the age. It was characteristic of her that this turning of personal grief into public good, this practical determination to fight a killer with the best means available, however novel and however resisted. The disease that had ravaged her family became, in her hands, the occasion for a public health measure that would save many lives. Through all these losses, her grief was real and deep, for whatever the dynastic calculations that governed her children's lives, she loved them as a mother, and each death wounded her. The woman who substituted one daughter for another to save a treaty was the same woman who mourned her dead children with genuine anguish, who felt each loss as a blow, who carried the accumulating weight of bereavement, husband and children together, through her last years like a stone on her heart. The black she wore for Francis came to stand for all of it, the whole long procession of the dead that marked her widowhood, the husband and the children, and the hopes buried one after another. She was a woman much acquainted with grief, and it showed in her face and her bearing and her spirit in these later years, the once vivid and high-spirited empress grown heavy and sombre under the weight of all she had lost. And yet she endured and governed and held her family and her empire together through it all, for endurance was perhaps her deepest gift, the capacity to absorb blow after blow and keep standing, keep working, keep ruling. The wars, the defeats, the death of her husband, the deaths of her children, her own near death, the long struggle with her son, all of it she bore, and went on. There remained, amid the grief, the consolation and the anxiety of her surviving children, and the work of settling them in the world, and one settlement above all still lay before her, the most important and the most fateful of all her dynastic arrangements, the marriage that would crown the great alliance with France and carry her youngest and most cherished daughter over the Alps to the most dazzling and most dangerous throne in Europe. Before we follow that daughter, though, we should pause in the brilliant city Maria Theresa had made and see the world she ruled at its height. Step out for a little while from the grief and the politics and look at the city she had made, for the Vienna of Maria Theresa's later reign was one of the wonders of Europe, and the world she had built and held together deserves to be seen at its height. Under her long rule and in the peace that followed her wars, the imperial capital flowered into a place of extraordinary beauty and brilliance, a city of baroque churches and palaces, of broad squares and gardens, of music and theatre and ceremony, the glittering centre of a great empire and one of the cultural capitals of the continent. The wealth and the order she had laboured to create showed itself in stone and in art. The strong, well-governed state had its visible face in a magnificent capital, and the woman in black at its heart presided over a golden age she had done as much as anyone to bring about. Picture it as a traveller of the time might have seen it, coming in from the surrounding country toward the spire of the cathedral, rising over the rooftops, entering streets thronged with carriages and liveried servants, and the bustle of a rich capital, passing the new palaces of the nobility and the older churches heavy with gold and painted saints. Out beyond the walls stood Schönbrunn in its gardens, the summer palace she loved, its long yellow front and its formal parterres, and the airy colonnade crowning the hill behind. Within the walls stood the rambling Hofburg, the winter seat of the dynasty, with its courtyards and chapels and the offices of a vast government. The whole place breathed the confidence and the magnificence of a power at peace, ordered, prosperous, devout, and supremely musical. For music above all was the glory of her Vienna. And it is no accident that Vienna became, in her reign and the generation after it, the musical capital of the age, the home of the greatest composers of the age. Maria Theresa loved music, had loved it since she sang as a girl in the family entertainments, and she filled her court and her palaces with it. The opera and the concert and the church music flourished under her patronage, and that of her family and her nobility. The reform of the opera, the works staged in the imperial theatres, the constant flow of music through the palaces and the churches, all of it made Vienna a place where musical genius could find a home and an audience. The child Mozart who had climbed into her lap was only the most famous of the talents that Vienna nurtured. The soil she had tended would, in the years just after her, bring forth the supreme flowering of Viennese music that has never been equalled. And it was not only music. The theatre flourished, the visual arts, the learning of the reformed university, the whole apparatus of a sophisticated court culture. The nobility built their town palaces and their country houses, filled them with pictures and porcelain and fine furniture, kept their orchestras and their libraries, lived the cultivated baroque life of the age in its fullest splendour. The church, rich and powerful, raised its glorious churches and monasteries, gilded and frescoed and triumphant. The court set the tone for all of it, the most ceremonious, and one of the most brilliant in Europe, and at its centre, presiding over the splendour in her widow's black, sat the Empress, the stout, grave matriarch, who had made it all possible by the long, hard labour of her rule. There is a particular pleasure in seeing her here, amid the beauty she had secured, because it corrects the picture of her as merely a grim worker and a grieving widow. She had built something, and it was magnificent, and she knew it, and took pleasure in it. The strong state, the full treasury, the reformed administration, all the unglamorous labour of her reign had this for its visible fruit: a capital at the height of its splendour, a flourishing culture, a people more prosperous and better ordered than she had found them, an empire that was not merely defended but adorned. The woman who had fought for her inheritance with such desperate courage in 1740 had, 40 years on, a golden city and a great culture to show for it, the outward sign of the inward achievement. But the magnificence, like everything else in her world, had its shadows, and a clear-eyed account of her cannot dwell only on the beauty and the achievement. The same devout, conservative, formidable will that built the golden city also pressed hard upon those who did not fit its rigid Catholic order, and the Vienna of Maria Theresa was, for some of her subjects, not a place of beauty and tolerance, but of suspicion and persecution. The great reformer was also, in matters of faith and morals, a harsh and narrow ruler, and the contradictions in her, the kindness and the cruelty springing from the same deep conviction, are nowhere clearer than in the darker aspects of her reign. Before we follow her cherished daughter to France, and her own life to its close, we must look honestly at these shadows, for they are as much a part of the true Maria Theresa as the courage and the music and the love. The shadows in her reign sprang from the very thing that was best in her, her faith, for Maria Theresa's Catholicism was deep and sincere and entirely without doubt, and a faith so absolute in a ruler of such power could be a hard and a cruel thing for those who stood outside it. She believed, with her whole being, that hers was the one true religion, and that it was her sacred duty as a Christian sovereign to uphold it and to suppress error. And from that conviction flowed a record of religious intolerance that sits uncomfortably beside her reforms and her genuine benevolence. She was, in matters of faith, a persecutor, and an honest account of her cannot look away from it. Her Protestant subjects felt the weight of it. In an age when much of Europe was moving, however slowly, toward a grudging toleration, Maria Theresa set her face against it harrying the Protestant communities within her lands, pressing them to conform, and in some cases deporting them, uprooting whole groups of her own subjects from their homes and resettling them far away because they would not embrace the Catholic faith. To her, this was not cruelty but duty, the protection of her people's souls and the purity of her realm, but it was experienced as cruelty by those it fell upon, families torn from their homes for the crime of worshipping otherwise than their sovereign decreed. Her own son Joseph, with his enlightened belief in toleration, was appalled by his mother's harshness in these matters, and the two of them clashed bitterly over it, the cool, tolerant son recoiling from the fervent, persecuting mother. Her treatment of the Jews of her empire was harsher still, and it is among the darkest chapters of her reign. She held the crude and ugly prejudices of her age against the Jewish people, and worse than held them, acted on them with the full power of the state. At one point she ordered the expulsion of the Jewish community from Prague and the Bohemian lands, a mass uprooting of thousands of people from homes they had lived in for generations, an act of collective cruelty driven by religious prejudice and suspicion. The decree caused such hardship and drew such protests and such practical difficulties that it was in time relaxed and the expelled allowed in some measure to return. But the intention had been plain, and it reveals a streak of real harshness in this otherwise often kindly woman, a cruelty that came, like so much in her, directly out of the certainties of her faith. And there was a narrowness in her zeal that reached into the private lives of her subjects in ways that strike us now as both oppressive and faintly absurd. Maria Theresa was determined to uphold not only the true religion but public morality, and she pursued the second with the same heavy hand as the first, setting up a body, half-mocked then and since, to police the morals of her capital, to root out vice and licentiousness and irregular conduct, to enforce a strict standard of behaviour on a court and a city that did not always welcome the supervision. This Morals Commission, with its spies and its raids and its prudish interventions, was the expression of the same controlling, righteous, intrusive instinct that drove her persecution of heretics, the conviction that the sovereign's duty extended to the souls and the conduct of her subjects, that a well-ordered Christian realm must be a virtuous one, and that virtue could be enforced by authority. It made her, in this respect, an oppressive ruler, prying and rigid and censorious, and it sat oddly with her own warm humanity, and even with the open infidelities of the husband she had loved. There is a way to hold these things together, the great reformer and the harsh persecutor, the warm mother and the cold expeller of the Jews, the builder of schools and the policer of morals. They were not contradictions to her at all, but expressions of a single coherent vision, the vision of a Christian sovereign whose duty was to order every part of her realm, the bodies and the souls and the conduct of her people alike, according to the true faith and the right order of things. The same conviction that moved her to build schools and reform medicine moved her to deport Protestants and expel Jews and police the morals of her capital. It was all, to her, the work of a good and Christian ruler, the shepherding of a people toward order and salvation. We may judge much of it harshly as her own son did, and we should, but we understand her better if we see that the kindness and the cruelty flowed from the same source, the absolute faith that was the bedrock of her whole nature. It is the mark of an honest reckoning with a historical figure that we hold the light and the dark together, neither whitewashing the cruelty nor letting it cancel the achievement. And Maria Theresa demands such honesty more than most, because she was so genuinely both. She was one of the great rulers of her age, courageous and able and benevolent, and she was also intolerant and harsh, and in her treatment of those outside her faith, cruel. Both are true. Both are her. And the contradictions in her reached their sharpest point in one final episode, an act of statecraft that troubled even her own conscience, where the practical ruler and the moral woman came into open conflict within her. And interest one. It is the episode of the partition of Poland, and it shows us Maria Theresa, for once, doing what she knew to be wrong, and knowing it, and doing it anyway. The partition of Poland came in the year 1772, and it was one of the great crimes of 18th century statecraft, the cold carving up of a large and ancient kingdom among its more powerful neighbours, who simply helped themselves to its territory because it was weak, and they were strong, and no one could stop them. Poland in this age was a realm fallen into disorder and helplessness, its government paralysed, its strength sapped, and around it stood three hungry powers, Russia and Prussia and Austria, who agreed among themselves to each take a slice of the defenceless country and divide its lands without the smallest pretence of justice. It was naked aggression, dressed in the forms of diplomacy, the strong devouring the weak, and it shocked the conscience of Europe, even in that cynical age. The architect of the scheme, fittingly, was Frederick of Prussia, Maria Theresa's old enemy, who saw in the dismemberment of Poland a chance for gain and pushed the partition forward, and Russia, the foremost power to the east, was a willing partner. Austria was invited to take her share, a large and valuable slice of Polish territory in the south, and here Maria Theresa faced a genuine crisis of conscience, for she knew with perfect clarity that the whole business was wrong. To seize the lands of a peaceful neighbour by force and fraud, to profit from the helplessness of another Christian realm, offended everything in her moral and religious sense. She called it unjust. She called it a stain. She protested against it in the strongest terms. She shrank from the wrong of it as her co-rulers did not, and she took her share anyway. This is the heart of the episode, and the thing that has fixed it as the great revelation of the gap between her conscience and her conduct. For all her protests, for all her moral anguish, Maria Theresa allowed herself to be persuaded that if Russia and Prussia were going to partition Poland regardless, then Austria could not afford to stand aside and let her rivals grow while she gained nothing, that the balance of power required her to take her portion lest her enemies be strengthened at her expense, that the wrong being unstoppable had at least better not be wholly to her disadvantage. And so, weeping and protesting, she signed, and Austria took her slice of the dismembered kingdom, the practical ruler overruling the moral woman within the same breast. It was her great enemy Frederick who fixed the moment forever in a single cutting phrase. Watching the Empress lament the injustice even as she pocketed the territory, the cynical King of Prussia remarked that she wept, but she took, that the more she cried over the wrong of it, the more she helped herself to the spoils. The jibe was cruel and it was unanswerable, for it caught exactly the spectacle of a ruler who knew she was doing wrong, said so, grieved over it, and did it all the same. It is one of the most famous remarks in the history of statecraft, and it has clung to Maria Theresa's name ever since. The perfect summary of the partition and of the contradiction it exposed in her. We should be careful what we make of it. It would be easy to dismiss her tears as hypocrisy, the crocodile weeping of a ruler who wanted the land and pretended to a conscience she did not have. But that is not quite fair, and it misses what is most interesting about the episode. Her anguish was real. She genuinely believed the partition was wrong. She really did protest and shrink and grieve. The point is not that her conscience was false, but that, in the end, it was not strong enough to override the cold logic of power, the calculation that in a world of predators, a state cannot afford to be the only one that keeps its hands clean. She was caught, as rulers so often are, between what she knew to be right and what she judged to be necessary, and she chose the necessary and hated herself a little for it. The tears were real, and so was the taking, and the tragedy of the thing is precisely that the two went together. It is, in a way, the most human episode in her whole reign, this moment of moral failure honestly felt, and it tells us more about her than any triumph. She was not a saint, whatever her piety. She was a ruler, with a ruler's hard necessities, and when conscience and interest collided, she came down, in the great test, on the side of interest, and knew it, and grieved. The empress who built schools and persecuted heretics and mourned her husband for 15 years and wept as she dismembered Poland was all one woman, complex and contradictory and intensely real. Neither the spotless heroine of the romantic legend nor the simple villain of the hostile account, but something more interesting than either, a flawed human being carrying an impossible burden as well, and as badly as such burdens are ever carried. And now, with her conscience troubled, and her health failing, and her reign drawing toward its close, there remained one last great act of her statecraft and her motherhood to perform, the act that would link her name forever to the most famous tragedy of the coming age. It was time to send her youngest daughter to France. Before we follow the youngest to France, we should understand the whole web of marriages, of which her match was only the most dazzling strand, for in the later years of her reign, Maria Theresa became the supreme matchmaker of Europe, settling her surviving daughters one by one upon the thrones of the continent and binding her house, through them, to half the ruling families of the age. It was the dynastic face of her motherhood, the use of her children as the instruments of policy, and she pursued it with the same calculating care she brought to a treaty, weighing each match for the advantage it would bring to her house and her alliances, arranging the unions, negotiating the terms, and then dispatching her daughters across the borders to take up their new lives among strangers. The daughters went where they were sent, as royal daughters did, to serve the interests of the family, and their feelings were not on the whole a part of the calculation. One was settled upon the Duke of Parma, in Italy, carrying the Habsburg connection into that small but strategic state. Another, as we have seen, was destined for the King of Naples, and when smallpox took the daughter first promised, Maria Theresa substituted a younger sister, Maria Carolina, to keep the valuable alliance whole, and Maria Carolina went to Naples and became in time a queen of real force and ambition, the dominant figure of her marriage and a power in Italian affairs, very much her mother's daughter. Through these matches the Empress wove her family into the fabric of European royalty, so that her descendants and her sons-in-law sat upon thrones from Italy to France, and she earned, with reason, her later reputation as a kind of grandmother or mother-in-law to the courts of Europe. She drove these marriages hard, and she did not let her daughters go once they were married, for the same fierce maternal supervision that had governed them in the nursery followed them across the frontiers into their new kingdoms. She managed their lives from a distance with the same restless energy she had managed them at home, never quite able to believe that a grown daughter on a foreign throne could be trusted to manage without her, and her children, queens and duchesses in their own right, were treated by her, to the end, as charges to be watched and corrected. It was love, and it was control, and the two were never separate in her. But amid all this calculating disposal of her daughters, there is one match that stands apart, and it reveals the romantic heart that still beat beneath the statesman's calculation, the same heart that had once held out for the husband she loved. For the daughter dearest to her of all, Maria Christina, Maria Theresa did something she did for none of her other children. She let her marry for love. Christina was her favourite, the child closest to her affections, and when Christina lost her heart to a prince who was no great dynastic prize, a younger son without a throne of his own, her mother, against all the logic of policy, permitted the match, and saw her beloved daughter wed the man of her own choosing. It was a privilege granted to no other of her children, and it caused real resentment among the sisters who had been packed off to strangers for the good of the house. But it was, for Maria Theresa, an irresistible indulgence of the daughter she loved most, and a flash of the woman who had herself wed for love showing through the empress who denied that same freedom to all her other girls. There is something deeply revealing in that one exception, in the fact that the great matchmaker, who arranged loveless dynastic unions for daughter after daughter without apparent qualm, could not bring herself to do it to the one child she loved best. It shows that she knew perfectly well what she was asking of the rest, knew the cost of a marriage to a stranger in a foreign land, having herself escaped that fate by the force of her own will. She had married for love and known the happiness of it. She sent her daughters to loveless marriages and knew what she was sending them to. And for the one she could not bear to wound, she made an exception that proved she understood the wound. It is one of those small human inconsistencies that tell us more than any grand statement. The favourites spared the fate imposed on all the rest. And the rest were not spared, least of all the youngest, the pretty heedless child of her later years, for whom the grandest and most dangerous match of all was being prepared. Marie Antoinette was not loved best, nor allowed any choice. She was the crucial piece in the greatest of all her mother's alliances, the union of Austria and France, that had been the masterstroke of the diplomatic revolution, and she was to be sent to seal it, to marry the heir to the French throne and bind the two houses together for a generation. It was the most brilliant match Maria Theresa ever made, and the one that would end most terribly, though no one could see that yet. The youngest daughter, raised somewhat carelessly in the shadow of her grander siblings, was about to be polished and prepared, and sent over the Alps to Versailles, to a destiny that would make her the most famous and most pitied queen in history. And her mother, who arranged it all, would not live to see how it ended. The match with France was the crown of Maria Theresa's whole diplomatic edifice, the living seal upon the great reversal of alliances that Kaunitz had engineered, and it was years in the making. To bind Austria and France together past the lifetimes of the present rulers, the two houses agreed that the heir to the French throne, the young Dauphin who would one day be King Louis XVI, should marry an Austrian archduchess, and the archduchess chosen was the Empress's youngest surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, known to history by the French form of her name, Marie Antoinette. She was a child still when the match was first set in motion, and the time before the wedding was spent preparing her, with a sudden and anxious intensity, for the role she had been somewhat carelessly left unready to fill. For the truth was that the youngest daughter had not been raised with the same close attention her mother had lavished on the elder children, and as the French match approached, Maria Theresa discovered with alarm how unprepared the girl was. Marie Antoinette was charming and pretty and good-natured, but she was also undereducated, idle at her lessons, poorly grounded in the things a future Queen of France would need to know, her command of the language imperfect, her learning thin, her character formed for pleasure rather than for the heavy duties ahead. In the time that remained, her mother flung herself into a desperate effort of remedial preparation, importing tutors from Paris, drilling the girl in language and deportment and the ways of the French court, trying to make up in a few years the neglect of many, to turn a heedless archduchess into a queen fit for the most demanding throne in Europe. It was, as events would show, not nearly enough. The wedding was arranged with all the splendour that two courts could command, and in the spring of 1770, the girl, just 14 years old, was sent away to France. The parting from her mother was final, in a way that royal partings so often were, for a princess sent to marry into a foreign court might never see her homeland or her family again, and mother and daughter both knew that this farewell, in all likelihood, was forever. Maria Theresa, who had supervised every step of the preparation, who had drilled and corrected and instructed her to the last, now had to let her go, to send her youngest child across the Alps to a strange country and a strange husband, and a destiny entirely out of her own control. Whatever her formidable composure, the parting cost her, for she loved her children, even the ones she had neglected, and she was sending this one into the unknown. The handover of the bride took place with a strange and elaborate ceremony on the very frontier between the two realms, and it has fixed itself in memory as one of the haunting images of the age. On an island in the river that marked the border, a special pavilion was raised, neutral ground belonging to neither country, and there the transfer was made with a ritual heavy with symbolism. The young Archduchess, by the custom of such handovers, was required to leave behind everything Austrian, her clothes, her possessions, even her attendants, to be stripped of all that belonged to her old life and her old country, and dressed anew in French garments, so that she should enter France as a wholly French creature, carrying nothing of Austria upon her. It was a symbolic death and rebirth, the Austrian Archduchess unmade and the French Dauphine made in her place, and there is something piercing in the picture of the bewildered 14-year-old girl, parted even from the friends and the clothes she had brought, handed over weeping on a river island between two countries, to be carried on into a future that would end 23 years later beneath the blade of the guillotine. Imagine the scene on that island in the river. The temporary pavilion raised on neutral ground, hung and furnished for the single day of the exchange, the Austrian party waiting on one side and the French on the other, and the child passing between them, out of one nation and into another. The attendants who had travelled with her, the familiar faces of home, were to go no further. Even the little dog she had brought, the story says, was taken from her. And then she was led through to the far side and presented to her new household, a bewildered girl among strangers who spoke of her now as the Dauphine of France, weeping for the home and the mother she would never see again. But the guillotine lay far in the unimaginable future, and on that spring day on the border there was only a frightened girl being passed from one world to another, and a mother far off in Vienna who had set the whole thing in motion, and now could only watch from a distance and worry. For Maria Theresa, the marriage was the supreme achievement of her statecraft, the great alliance sealed at last in the flesh of her own daughter, a triumph of policy that bound Austria and France together, and crowned the work of decades. And it was also, from the very first, a source of gnawing anxiety, for she knew her daughter's weaknesses better than anyone, knew how unready the girl was, knew the dangers of the glittering and treacherous court to which she had sent her, and she could not be there to guide her through them. The triumph and the dread went together from the start. And so she did the only thing she could, the thing she had always done with her absent children, only now with a special urgency and a special fear. She wrote, from the day her daughter crossed the frontier, Maria Theresa poured out to her a stream of letters, a ceaseless correspondence of advice and warning and reproach and love, trying to guide and govern and protect her youngest child across the hundreds of miles that separated them, to be, by ink and paper, the mother at the girl's side that she could not be in person. Those letters, written over the last decade of her life, are among the most remarkable documents she left, and they carry beneath their nagging surface a deep and prophetic foreboding, as though the old empress sensed from far-off Vienna the gathering of the storm that would one day destroy the daughter she had sent to France. The letters that flowed from Vienna to Versailles over the last 10 years of Maria Theresa's life are one of the most extraordinary records of motherhood that history has preserved, and they are heavy with a worry that reads, across the centuries, almost like prophecy. Month after month, year after year, the old empress wrote to her daughter, the young Dauphine, and then Queen of France, and the letters mingle, in a way that is wholly characteristic of her, the tenderest love and the sharpest reproach, the anxious affection of a mother, and the shrewd political counsel of a sovereign who understood the perils of thrones far better than her heedless child ever would. She worried about everything, and she said so, at length and without restraint. She worried about her daughter's frivolity, her love of pleasure and gambling and fashion, her neglect of serious things, her failure to apply herself to the duties of her position. She worried about the young woman's relations with her husband, about the slow and troubled beginnings of the marriage, about the failure, over many a long season, to produce the heir on which everything depended. She worried about her conduct at the French court, about the enemies she was making and the friends she was choosing, about the way she carried herself and the impression she gave. She lectured, she scolded, she advised, she begged. She told her daughter to be more serious, more careful, more dutiful, more discreet. She reached across the Alps to govern the girl's conduct as she had governed it in the nursery, and she did it out of a love that was real, and a fear that was, as it turned out, entirely justified. For beneath the nagging there ran a deep and growing dread, a sense that her daughter was drifting toward catastrophe and that she, the mother, was powerless to prevent it. Maria Theresa knew courts, knew the treacherous brilliance of Versailles, knew how a frivolous and indiscreet young queen could make herself hated, and she watched from afar with mounting alarm as her daughter, heedless of her warnings, gave way to pleasure and extravagance and the giddy life of the most dangerous court in Europe. The Empress's letters grow darker as the years pass, more urgent, more foreboding. She senses, with the instinct of a ruler who has weathered every kind of storm, that trouble is gathering around her child, and she cannot make the girl hear it. There is something almost unbearable in the spectacle of the wise old mother, far away and failing, seeing the danger clearly and crying her warnings into a silence that would not heed them. She did not live to see the worst of it, and that is the one mercy in the whole story. Maria Theresa died in the year 1780, nearly a decade before the French Revolution broke, and so she was spared the knowledge of how completely her foreboding would be fulfilled. She did not see her daughter become the most hated woman in France, the symbol of everything the people came to loathe about the old order, the foreign queen blamed for every grievance. She did not see the revolution sweep away the throne she had laboured so hard to bind to her own house. She did not see her daughter imprisoned, tried, condemned, and carried in a cart through the jeering streets of Paris to the scaffold, to die beneath the guillotine in the autumn of the year 1793, a full generation after she had been handed over weeping on the river island. The mother who had sent her there, and worried over her, and foreseen so much, was more than a decade in her grave when the blade fell. It is one of the most poignant facts in her whole story, this near miss of knowledge, the way her death drew a line just short of the catastrophe she had dreaded. She had spent 10 years foreseeing disaster for her youngest child, and she was spared the sight of it. Her foreboding was vindicated, terribly, but she did not have to witness the vindication. We who know the end read her anxious letters with a knowledge she did not have, and they take on a tragic weight she could only half feel, the warnings of a mother who sensed the storm coming and died before it broke, leaving her daughter to face it alone. The story that began with the child climbing into her lap and led to the bride sent over the Alps runs on past Maria Theresa's death to its terrible conclusion, but she herself does not run on with it. Her part ends in worry and foreboding, in letters crying warnings into the dark, and then in her own death, mercifully blind to what was coming. For her own end was now drawing near, and the last stretch of her life was lived under the accumulating weight of age and grief and illness. The youngest daughter was settled in France, beyond her reach but not beyond her worry. The great work of her reign was done. The empire was as strong and as well ordered as she could make it. Her difficult son stood ready, straining to take it on. The old empress, stout and breathless and worn, mourning her husband still in her black gowns, fretting over her distant daughter, quarrelling with her impatient heir, governed on through her failing years with the dutiful perseverance that had carried her through every trial. But her strength was going at last, and the woman who had held the House of Austria together for 40 years against wars and defeats and deaths was coming, herself, to the end of the road. The last great political struggle of her life was not against a foreign enemy, but against her own son, and it showed the war-weary old empress fighting, in the twilight of her reign, to hold her impatient heir back from the brink of another ruinous war. For Joseph, restless and ambitious and hungry for the territorial gains his mother had taught herself to forego, saw an opportunity, in the late 1770s, to enlarge the Habsburg lands at the expense of Bavaria, whose ruling line had failed, and he pressed forward to seize a large slice of Bavarian territory, in just the kind of bold, aggressive stroke that Frederick of Prussia had so often made, and that Joseph admired. It was exactly the sort of adventure that Maria Theresa, schooled by the terrible cost of the 7 Years' War, had come to dread above all things. She was horrified. She saw in Joseph's Bavarian scheme the seeds of a new general war, another bloody and ruinous struggle with Prussia, who would never allow Austria to grow so much without a fight. She saw her empire dragged back into the kind of conflict that had cost her so dearly and gained her nothing, and she set herself, in the last years of her life and against the will of her own co-regent's son, to prevent it. When Frederick predictably moved to block the Austrian gains, and the two powers stood once more on the edge of war, Maria Theresa did something remarkable, something that reveals both her desperation for peace and her undiminished will. She went behind her son's back. Secretly, without Joseph's knowledge, the old empress opened her own negotiations with her ancient enemy Frederick, the man she had hated for 40 years, reaching out to him directly to find a way to stop the war that her son had started and that she was determined to end. It was an extraordinary thing to do, a sovereign negotiating in secret against the policy of her own heir and co-ruler, reaching across a lifetime of enmity to the great enemy of her reign in the cause of peace. And it worked, after a fashion. The war that broke out was a brief and bloodless affair, more a matter of marching and manoeuvring and the eating up of the countryside than of pitched battles, and it was brought to an end by negotiation before it could grow into the catastrophe she feared. Austria gained a small strip of territory and abandoned the larger ambition, and the general war was averted. Maria Theresa had got her peace, at the price of humbling her son's grand designs and going behind his back to do it, and Joseph was bitterly mortified to discover that his mother had been treating with the enemy without his knowledge. The episode is the perfect emblem of her last years, of the long struggle between the cautious, peace-loving, war-weary mother and the bold, ambitious, reforming son, locked together in the government of an empire and pulling against each other to the end. She had learned in the hard school of her own wars the true cost of military ambition, and she spent the strength of her old age trying to spare her empire and her son the lessons she had learned so painfully. He, who had not lived through her struggles, was eager to make the very mistakes she had bled to understand. That she prevailed in this last great test, that she pulled her empire back from another war, even at the cost of deceiving her own heir, was a final vindication of the wisdom she had bought so dearly, and perhaps her last great service to the land she had governed for 40 years. But the effort cost her, for she was old now and ailing, and the strain of these final struggles told on a body and spirit already worn down by grief and overwork. She had become, in her later years, stout to the point of corpulence, heavy and breathless, troubled increasingly by the failure of her lungs and her heart, finding the ordinary business of moving and breathing a labour. The vivid, energetic woman of her prime had given way to a tired, sombre, failing old empress, weighed down by her body and her bereavements and her cares, governing on by sheer force of duty long after the joy had gone out of her life. She wore her widow's black. She mourned her husband still. She worried over her distant daughter. She quarrelled with and restrained her son, and she worked, as she had always worked, through the papers and the dispatches, holding the reins of the empire in her failing hands. She knew her end was coming, and she faced it as she had faced everything, with a clear eye and a deep faith and a kind of grim composure. She had long since prepared for death, in the literal sense, for she had readied her own resting place, the tomb where she would lie beside the husband she had mourned for 15 years, the double sarcophagus she had commissioned, so that she and Francis should lie together at the last, as they had lived together in life. She had made her peace with her God, in whom she had never for a moment ceased to believe. She had done her work and settled her children, and held her empire together. And she waited, with the patience of a soul long acquainted with grief, for the summons she knew could not be far off. The great reign was almost over. The woman who had held the House of Austria together for 4 decades was coming to the end of her road, and she met it, as she had met every trial of her life, with courage. The end came in the late autumn of the year 1780. Through that final November the old empress declined, her labouring lungs and failing heart at last giving way, and it became plain to those around her, and to herself, that she was dying. She was 63 years old, and she had reigned for 4 decades, and the long life that had begun in quiet disappointment in the Hofburg was drawing to its close in the same palace, amid the same family, in the city she had ruled for 4 decades. She met her death with the composure and the faith that had carried her through every storm of her existence, fully aware of what was happening, attending to it with the same clear practicality she had brought to everything, setting her affairs in order and preparing her soul for the end. There is a particular dignity in the accounts of her last hours, the dignity of a woman who refused to flinch from death and would not let it find her unready or undignified. She knew she was going, and she did not pretend otherwise, nor did she give way to fear or despair. She made her farewells, received the rites of the church she had served so devoutly, and composed herself for the end with a steady courage. There is a story, often told and very much in character, that as her last night wore on and she struggled for breath, those around her urged her to try to rest, to compose herself for sleep, and she answered that she did not wish to sleep, for she wished to meet her death awake and aware, not to be taken in her sleep, but to go to her end with open eyes. Whether the words are exact or not, they capture the woman exactly, the refusal to be eased into the dark, the insistence on facing it fully, the courage that had never failed her, failing her not even now. And so, on the 29th of November, in the year 1780, Maria Theresa died in her palace in Vienna, surrounded by her family, in the faith of her fathers, after a reign of 40 years. The great empress was gone. The woman who had come to a threatened throne at 23, heavily pregnant and untrained and surrounded by enemies, who had been expected to lose everything, and had instead held her empire together against half of Europe, who had rebuilt a weak state into a strong one, and borne 16 children, and married her daughters across the continent, and mourned her husband for 15 years in black, had come at last to the end of her laden and weary life. The reign that had begun in the chaos of 1740 ended quietly in a curtained chamber, with the death of an old woman who had carried more than most could bear, and carried it to the end. They laid her where she had wished to lie, in the cool stone crypt beneath the Capuchin church in Vienna, among the ancestors and the descendants of her house. And they laid her, as she had arranged, beside Francis, the husband she had loved and mourned so long, so that the two of them should not be parted any longer. It was the place she had made ready with her own forethought while she still lived, and the widow was joined to her emperor at the last, side by side beneath the church in the city she had ruled. With her death the empire passed wholly to Joseph, who had waited so long and so impatiently in the harness beside her, and who now, freed at last from his mother's restraining hand, flung himself into the headlong program of radical reform he had been straining toward for 15 years. He would reign for a decade, and his reign would be a whirlwind of change, much of it generous and enlightened in intention, much of it too fast and too harsh for his peoples to bear, and much of it ending in failure and reversal. And there were those who said, watching the upheavals of Joseph's sole reign, that the old empress had understood her empire better than her brilliant son, that her caution had been wisdom, that in holding him back she had known what she was about. The contrast between the mother's patient, conservative, deeply rooted rule and the son's brilliant, impatient, often unworkable radicalism became, after her death, one of the great object lessons of the age. But all of that belonged to the time after her, and our concern is with the woman herself, now laid to rest beside her husband in the crypt in Vienna, her long reign ended, her great work done. Her story, from the morning of her birth to the night of her death, runs on past her, of course into the lives of the children she left behind, and above all into the terrible fate awaiting the youngest daughter she had sent to France and would not live to mourn. But the life itself is complete, the cradle and the grave joined at last, the whole long arc of it laid out before us. And so, with the Empress in her tomb, it remains only to ask what we are to make of her, this remarkable woman whose entire life we have now walked, from the disappointed silence that greeted her birth to the composed courage of her death, and to give her the reckoning she deserves. Before we weigh her achievement, let us look once more at the family she left behind, for it was through her children that Maria Theresa reached furthest into the future, and the house she founded outlasted her by far. She was by blood and marriage the matriarch of much of royal Europe, the ancestress of a line of sovereigns, and the mother-in-law or grandmother of half the ruling families of the continent. Through the marriages she had arranged with such care, her descendants sat upon thrones across Europe, and the dynasty she headed, the union of her own Habsburg blood with the House of Lorraine through her beloved Francis, became the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, the line that would rule Austria and command the imperial dignity for well over a century after her death, down almost to the modern age. The woman who had been handed a threatened and indefensible inheritance had not merely held it, she had founded a dynasty that endured. The fates of her surviving children make a remarkable and a varied tapestry, ranging from the brilliant to the tragic. Her eldest son, Joseph, the impatient reformer, ruled after her as emperor, drove his whirlwind of change, and died disappointed, his great schemes largely undone, worn out by the resistance his haste had provoked. On his deathbed, it is said, he composed for himself the bitter epitaph of a man who had meant well in everything, and yet succeeded in almost nothing he had set out to do. After him came her steadier son, Leopold, who had ruled Tuscany wisely, and now succeeded to the empire, a more cautious and capable sovereign in his mother's mould, who quietly undid some of his brother's harsher measures, though his own reign was brief. Her daughter Maria Carolina, sent to Naples in her dead sister's place, became a formidable and dominant queen, a force in Italian affairs for decades, her mother's daughter in her energy and her will. Another daughter, Maria Amalia, was married into Parma and chafed against the controlling letters that pursued her there, as they pursued all the sisters. Others were placed in convents or kept at home, and there were the rest, scattered across the courts and cloisters of Europe, living out the destinies their mother had arranged for them, some in contentment and some in quiet resentment of the formidable hand that had disposed of them. But it is the youngest, of course, whose fate towers over all the rest and casts its long shadow back across the whole family. For Marie Antoinette became the most famous and the most tragic of all Maria Theresa's children, and her end was the most terrible. The pretty heedless girl who had been sent over the Alps to seal the Great Alliance grew into the Queen of France, and then into the most hated woman in the kingdom, the foreign queen blamed for every grievance, the symbol of a doomed old order. And when the revolution came and swept that order away, she was imprisoned and reviled, and at last beheaded, carried in a cart through the jeering streets to die beneath the guillotine, the daughter of the great empress meeting an end as dreadful as any in the history of fallen royalty. Maria Theresa's most brilliant match had become her family's most appalling tragedy. Blonde. There is a terrible symmetry in it that the old chroniclers love to point out, that the marriage which crowned the mother's statecraft destroyed the daughter, that the alliance meant to secure the future helped instead to consume one of the houses it joined. The diplomatic revolution, the masterstroke of Maria Theresa's reign, the binding of Austria and France, had carried her child to the throne that the revolution would destroy. The triumph of policy had become the instrument of catastrophe. And the one mercy, as we have seen, was that the mother did not live to see it, that her death came a decade before the storm broke, so that she went to her grave with her foreboding unfulfilled in fact, spared the knowledge of how completely her fears would be vindicated. She had dreaded disaster for her daughter. She did not have to watch it come. So the family she founded carried within it the whole range of human fortune, the able and the failing, the triumphant and the doomed, the long-lived dynasty and the murdered queen, all of it springing from the formidable woman who had borne and raised and dispatched them, and who lay now in her tomb in Vienna beside the husband she had loved. Her blood ran on through the thrones of Europe. Her name became a byword for a certain kind of female sovereignty, formidable and maternal and devout. Her dynasty endured into the 20th century, when the last of her descendants would at last be swept from the imperial throne by the upheavals of a later age. She had reached far into the future, this woman, far beyond her own long life, through the brood of children she had given to the courts of Europe. And she had done something more than found a dynasty, something that sets her apart in the long history of her house and of European monarchy. She had shown, by the plain fact of her reign, what a woman could do with sovereign power, in an age that did not believe a female ruler could wield it at all. That, in the end, may be the heart of her achievement, and it is to the weighing of that achievement, to the final reckoning of what Maria Theresa was and what she did, that we now come, having traced the whole long course of her life from the cradle to the grave. And so we come to the reckoning, to the question of what we are to make of her, this person whose entire life we have now followed from the disappointed silence that met her birth to the composed courage of her death. She is less famous today than she ought to be, overshadowed in the popular memory by her tragic daughter and by her brilliant rival Frederick, remembered, if at all, as a name attached to old Vienna or as the mother of Marie Antoinette. But she deserves better than that faint remembrance, for by any fair measure she was one of the great rulers of the 18th century, and one of the most remarkable women ever to hold sovereign power, and the achievement of her 40 years deserves to be seen clearly and weighed honestly. And consider first the sheer scale of what she did. She came to a threatened throne as an untrained young woman, heavily pregnant, surrounded by enemies, counseled to surrender, with an empty treasury and a broken army and a sprawl of indefensible lands that half of Europe meant to carve up, and she held it all together, against every expectation, through courage and will, and a genius for rule that no one had suspected in her. She defied the predators, rallied her peoples, fought a great war to a standstill, and saved her inheritance very nearly whole. Then, having saved it, she remade it, transforming a weak and disorganized collection of provinces into a stronger, richer, better-governed modern state, with a real army, a fuller treasury, reformed laws, a reformed university, and something close to universal schooling, all of it driven through against entrenched resistance by her own tireless application. She did this while bearing 16 children and running the largest household in Europe and marrying her daughters across the continent. It is an almost superhuman record of labour and achievement, and she compiled it in an age that did not think a woman capable of any of it. And she did it. This is the crucial point, as a woman, in a world built entirely on the assumption that rule was a man's business. She could not even hold the imperial title that her position seemed to demand. She had to win it for her husband, and rule the substance of power while he held the form. Everywhere she turned, she met the assumption that her sex could not govern, could not lead, could not be obeyed, and everywhere she disproved it by the plain fact of governing, leading, and being obeyed for 40 years more effectively than almost any man of her age. She was not a feminist. She would not have understood the word, and she held conventional views about the proper place of women that her own life contradicted at every turn. But by simply being what she was, a woman who ruled, and ruled greatly, she stood as a living refutation of the prejudice of her time, and she opened a space in the imagination of Europe that had not been there before. We should not make her a saint, for she was not one, and the honest reckoning must hold the shadows alongside the light. She was intolerant, and her intolerance caused real suffering. She persecuted Protestants and expelled Jews and policed the morals of her subjects with a heavy and intrusive hand, all out of the absolute faith that was the bedrock of her character. She took her share of the partition of Poland knowing it was wrong, weeping as she took it, the great test of her conscience that she failed and knew she failed. She could be harsh, rigid, controlling, narrow. She held her brilliant son back from reforms that history would partly vindicate. She ruled her children's lives with a love that shaded into tyranny. The same deep conviction that made her great made her, in places, cruel, and a true account of her cannot look away from it. But the contradictions are part of what makes her so human and so compelling, for she was not a figure of legend, good or bad, but a real and complicated human being carrying an impossible burden, as well as such burdens are ever carried. She was brave and she was harsh. She was loving and she was controlling. She was a great reformer and a stubborn persecutor. She wept over Poland and she took it. She adored her husband and forgave his infidelities and mourned him for 15 years. She neglected her youngest daughter and then strove desperately to save her by ink across the Alps. She was all of these things at once, held together by the iron core of her faith and her will and her sense of duty. And the unity beneath the contradictions is the unity of a single, coherent, formidable human being, doing what she believed to be right with everything she had. That is the woman we have walked beside this evening, from the cradle in the Hofburg to the tomb beside her Francis, and she is, I think, worth the knowing. Not the romantic heroine of legend, nor the persecuting bigot of the hostile account, but the real Maria Theresa, the unprepared girl who became the great empress, the devout and stubborn and tireless woman who held a continent's worth of lands together for 40 years, and bore 16 children and saved her inheritance and remade her state, and founded a dynasty, and sent her daughter to a throne and a scaffold. She, would not live to see. She kept the House of Austria together when everyone expected it to fall, and she held it as a woman in a world of men, and she kept it to the very end. There are not many of whom so much can truly be said, and fewer still who were women, and fewer still who did it all, as she did, with a baby on the way, and a husband to love, and a house full of children to raise, in an age that gave her sex no power, and expected of it no greatness. There is a last image I would have you carry away from this evening, and it is the one in which the whole of her, the empress and the private person, the ruler and the wife, seems to me to gather into a single quiet scene. Come down, in your mind, into the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church in the heart of Vienna, the great burial vault of the Habsburgs, a cool stone undercroft where the rulers of her house lie in their ranked and ornamented sarcophagi, generation upon generation, Benissy city above. It is a sombre place, and a moving one, the resting place of a dynasty, and somewhere near its heart stands the tomb that Maria Theresa made for herself and her husband, the great double sarcophagus where the two of them lie side by side, as she had wished for all the centuries since. She had prepared it herself years before she died in the long widowhood when grief for Francis never left her, while she still lived and ruled, mourning him in her black gowns, counting the days of her separation from him. She had this tomb made ready, this monument designed to hold them both, so that the husband she had loved since she was a child and lost so suddenly in that corridor at Innsbruck should not lie alone, and so that she, when her own time came, should be laid beside him at the last. It was the act of a woman whose love outlived its object by 15 years and looked forward, even in the midst of rule, to the reunion that only death could bring. The empress who governed a continent spent some of her grief planning the bed where she would lie with her husband forever, and there they lie. The sculptors made the tomb in the style of the age, the two of them shown together in their majesty, and there is a detail in it that catches at the heart, for the figures of the husband and wife are shown turned toward each other, gazing into each other's faces, as a devoted couple might lie together in life. It is a strange and tender thing, this monument of a love that survived everything, the wars and the infidelities and the long parting of death, set in stone in the crypt of Vienna, the great empress and her easy-going emperor, reunited at the last, looking into each other's eyes for eternity beneath the church. Of all the images her long life offers, the battlefields and the council chambers and the crowded nurseries and the streams of letters, it is this quiet one, the prepared tomb and the reunited figures, that perhaps says the most about who she truly was beneath the crown. For she was, in the end, a soul who loved with her whole heart, and whose loves were the deepest things in her, deeper even than her crown and her faith, or rather wholly bound up with them. She loved her husband past death and past reason. She loved her children with a fierce, controlling devotion that pursued them across the borders of Europe. She worshipped her God with an absolute and unquestioning faith that was the foundation of her whole being. She cared for her peoples in her stern way and laboured for them tirelessly, and she carried all these loves and the griefs that came with them through 40 years of the heaviest rule in Europe, and never let go of any of them. The tomb in the crypt, the reunion she planned and waited for and at last attained, is the fitting last image of such a woman, the great ruler who was, beneath everything, a wife longing to lie again beside the man she had lost. So we leave her there, in the cool quiet of the crypt beneath Vienna, lying beside her Francis at the end of her long road, her wars and her labours and her griefs all behind her, the disappointed silence that met her birth answered at last by the long achievement of her life and the peace of her death. The little archduchess who was not supposed to rule had ruled greatly, The unprepared girl had become the great empress. The wife who married for love lay down at last beside the husband she had mourned. The whole long arc of it, from the cradle in the Hofburg to the tomb in the crypt, is complete, and she rests where she wished to rest, in the heart of the city she ruled, in the faith she never doubted, beside the man she never stopped loving. It has been, I think, a journey worth the walking, and I am glad to have walked it with you, from the winter morning of her birth to the November night of her death, through the wars and the reforms and the family and the grief, all the way to the quiet tomb where the empress and her emperor lie gazing at each other in the dark. There is a deep peace in such an ending, in the thought of a hard life come to its rest, and it is a good thought to carry with you towards sleep. The great empress laid down at last beside her love, her work all done, her cares all ended, sleeping the last sleep beneath the church in Vienna, while the city she built goes on above her in the light. That is the life of Maria Theresa, the only woman ever to rule the empire of the Habsburgs in her own right, the saver and the rebuilder of her inheritance, the matriarch of half the thrones of Europe, the mother of the most famous and most tragic of all queens, and the wife who lies gazing at her husband still in the crypt beneath Vienna. She was handed an empire that the law of her age said no woman could hold, and she held it for 40 years, and remade it, and passed it on, and through it all she remained a woman of large heart and deep faith and unbreakable will, brave and flawed, and entirely real. She deserves to be remembered for more than her daughter's fate, and if this evening has brought her a little out of that long shadow and into the light, then it has done what I hoped. If these long evenings in the company of the people of the past are a thing that brings you some quiet at the end of the day, then you are always welcome to stay a while in this corner and to come back to it whenever you wish. And a gentle way to find your way back is simply to follow along, so that the next of these evenings will be here waiting for you when you want it. There is no need to do anything at all tonight but rest. We have spent these few hours together in old Vienna, in the company of an empress, and now the candles can be let go out, and the palace can sink back into its long sleep, and so, gently, can you sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.